Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. I woke up early that morning, just as the first light of day stretched across my bedroom window. It was one of those rare mornings when I had no obligations, no schedule to follow. I could stay in bed, wrapped in my soft blanket, and let the world outside pass by. But something felt off. There was a quiet unease in the air, as if the world had paused, holding its breath. I shook it off. It had been a long time since I'd lived alone, and I was used to the silence. At least, that's what I told myself. The house was still. Too still. I couldn't even hear the usual hum of the fridge or the faint sounds of cars passing by outside. Everything seemed muted, like the world was wrapped in cotton. My feet touched the cool wooden floor as I slowly got out of bed, trying not to disturb the calm. As I made my way to the kitchen, I noticed something strange. At first, it seemed normal, just the usual dust on the floor, scattered here and there from days of me walking around. But then, I saw it. Right there on the polished surface of the living room floor. A set of footprints. Bare, almost delicate prints, leading from the front door and stopping just at the edge of the hallway, where they disappeared into the bedroom. I froze. My pulse quickened. I was alone last night. I had been home alone, the door locked. The windows shut tight. No one had entered. And yet, here they were. The prints were faint, not deep, but distinct enough that I couldn't dismiss them. A chill crept up my spine, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I stepped forward cautiously, my heart racing. The floor creaked under my weight, but the prints remained untouched. I walked along the path, each step louder in the stillness. As I approached my bedroom, the footsteps seemed to lead me in, invited me in. Hesitation gnawed at me. What if? I reached the door, but stopped before I could push it open. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and I tried to think logically. There was no way anyone had entered. I hadn't heard anything, no door opening, no footsteps, nothing. Yet, those prints were there. The silence in the house deepened, pressing on me like an invisible weight. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and leave, but curiosity rooted me to the spot. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat echoing in the quiet. I opened the door, slowly, and stepped inside. The bedroom was as I had left it. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, nothing seemed out of place. But the air felt heavier. Tense. It was as if something was waiting, just out of sight. I glanced around. No one. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I turned back to the floor, to the faint marks leading me here. My skin prickled. Those prints were closer now, practically at my feet. I bent down, inspecting them closely. They were almost too perfect, too deliberate, as if whoever made them had meant for me to find them. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to acknowledge the creeping thought that was crawling into my mind, pushing all reason aside. I was alone. I had to be. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. A faint, shifting outline in the corner of the room. It wasn't natural, it didn't move the way shadows should. It stretched unnaturally, a distortion in the air itself. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Was it just the lighting? The way the sun hit the walls? Or was something else here with me? A creak from behind me snapped me out of my trance. I whipped around, but there was nothing. Just the empty room, still and silent. I was alone. I had to be. But deep down, something told me that I wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling. That shadow in the corner of the room, it had felt too real. Too present. But there was nothing there now. Just the walls, the bed, the floor, everything in its usual place. I glanced back down at the footprints. They were still there, leading to the bed, and then there was nothing. No prints continuing beyond the bed. As if the person had vanished or never existed at all. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. I needed to focus. I had to calm down. Maybe I had imagined it. I hadn't slept well the past few days. Maybe that's what it was, exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But no, the prints were real. I had seen them with my own eyes. I stepped back from the door, retreating into the hallway, my mind racing. I could hear the distant tick-tock of the clock in the living room. The sound was deafening now, as though it was amplifying every step I took, every thought I had. I walked towards the kitchen, hoping to shake the strange tension that had settled over me. The floor was cold under my feet as I moved, the quiet hum of my house the only sound. I made a cup of tea, my hands trembling as I poured the hot water. I needed something to calm my nerves, something to convince myself that nothing was wrong. The steam rose from the cup, curling into the air like a whisper. I held it in my hands, but the warmth didn't reach my chest. The anxiety lingered. I took a sip, trying to distract myself, but the sensation of being watched persisted. It was like someone was standing just behind me, their presence close, but invisible. I turned quickly, my heart racing, but there was no one. The kitchen was empty, just the usual counters and the window overlooking the street outside. The street. That's when I noticed it. Through the window, I saw something move in the yard, something dark, something shifting near the edge of the trees. A flicker, like a shadow darting past the fence. I quickly set the cup down, my pulse thundering in my ears. I wasn't imagining this. I knew what I had seen. There was something out there. I rushed to the door, my breath quickening, and peered through the glass. But the yard was empty. Nothing. Just the usual rows of bushes and the rustling leaves. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining my eyes to see any sign of movement, but nothing appeared. The yard seemed peaceful, almost unnaturally still. I stepped back from the door, shaking my head, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. Then, as I turned to leave, I heard it. A faint creak. Like someone stepping carefully on the floorboards behind me. I froze. Slowly, I turned, my heart in my throat. No one. But the creaking sound, it was real. It was coming from the hallway, from the direction of my bedroom. I swallowed hard, and for a moment, I considered calling someone. Anyone. But then the voice in my head told me to calm down, to think rationally. I hadn't heard anything unusual before. There were no locks tampered with, no signs of forced entry. I was still alone, the house still as it had been. But the footprints. The shadow. The creak. It was all too much. I walked slowly back to the hallway, my steps cautious, deliberate. Each one echoed in the silence, stretching longer than it should. My own breathing was the loudest sound, and my pulse seemed to beat in time with every footfall. I reached the bedroom door again. The prints were still there, waiting for me. I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to turn and run. I stepped over the threshold. The room was dark. The sunlight hadn't reached it yet, leaving it in a cool, dim haze. The bed was still undisturbed, but the air felt wrong. It felt thick, as if something unseen was pressing against me. I scanned the room quickly, looking for any sign of a person. Anything that might explain the feeling of dread building in my chest. Nothing. But the air, the silence, it was pressing on me. The longer I stood there, the more the weight of it became unbearable. That's when I noticed it. A sound. A faint, almost imperceptible tapping. Coming from the direction of the closet. It was soft at first, like fingers lightly drumming on wood. I took a step closer to the closet. My mind was racing now, fear and doubt blending together. Was it a person? A mouse? Something else? The tapping continued. Louder now. Steady. Unmistakable. It was coming from inside the closet. I stood frozen, the tapping echoing in my ears, each sound like a small, deliberate strike against the stillness of the room. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I just stared at the closet door, my mind racing through every possible explanation, none of which felt right. I didn't want to open that door. Something deep inside me screamed not to. But I couldn't ignore the sound. It was real. Too real. The room felt colder now, the air dense and heavy. I could feel my skin tingling, as if the very atmosphere was alive, pressing against me. I swallowed hard, and my legs, though shaking, moved toward the closet. Each step was like wading through thick water, every inch more difficult than the last. The tapping continued. Soft, but insistent. It didn't stop. It didn't falter. My hand reached for the doorknob, and for a second, I hesitated. What if it wasn't a person? What if it was something worse? I knew I should walk away. I knew I should leave the house and never come back. But I couldn't. With a deep breath, I twisted the knob and pulled the door open. The closet was dark inside, filled with the clutter of my life, old coats, shoes, and boxes I hadn't touched in months. But there, in the back corner, something shifted. I could barely make it out, just a faint shadow moving against the wall. The tapping stopped immediately. I stepped back, my heartbeat deafening in my ears. My hand instinctively reached for the light switch, but I hesitated. If I turned on the light, I would see it, whatever it was. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to see it. A chill ran down my spine. The air in the room felt even heavier, as though the walls were closing in, the space growing smaller with each passing second. Then, without warning, the door to the closet slammed shut on its own. I gasped and stumbled back, my mind spinning. I couldn't comprehend what had just happened. There was no wind, no draft, no explanation for the force that made the door slam so violently. It was as though something had been waiting inside, waiting for the right moment to act. I stood there, breathless, staring at the closet door. My fingers were numb as they gripped the edge of the bedpost, the only thing steady in the room. I couldn't move. I didn't know if I should scream, run, or stay and face whatever this was. I glanced toward the bedroom door, hoping to escape, but the hallway beyond seemed even darker now, as though something had slipped in from the edges of my perception. A figure, a shadow, something that I couldn't quite make out, was standing at the end of the hallway. My mind raced. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence, its weight in the space around me. It wasn't human. I knew that much. I wasn't alone. It moved. Slowly, deliberately, towards me. I turned and ran. My feet slapped against the floor, the sound of my own panic deafening as I darted toward the door. I didn't look back, couldn't look back. The sound of something following me, footsteps, soft but unmistakable, followed in my wake. Each footstep echoed in the hallway, getting closer, faster. I reached the door, my hand shaking as I grabbed the handle. My pulse was thumping in my ears, my breath short and ragged. I threw open the door and bolted down the stairs, the wood creaking beneath me with each hurried step. I wasn't sure where I was going. I wasn't sure if I even cared anymore. I just needed to get out. I needed to escape. As I reached the front door, I heard it again, the tapping. Closer now, as if something was right behind me. I reached for the doorknob, fumbling, my fingers too shaky to get a proper grip. Then I heard it. The whisper. Not a voice, but something else. Something soft, like a breath against my ear. You shouldn't have come back. I froze. The words were clear, unmistakable. It wasn't my mind playing tricks. It was a voice, a breath, so close to my ear I could feel it. I didn't wait another second. With one last desperate push, I threw open the door and ran into the cold night air. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face as I stumbled outside. My lungs burned as I gasped for breath, each inhale sharp and shallow. The night was silent, too silent, and my footsteps felt like they were pounding the earth beneath me, each one louder than the last. The darkness around me seemed to press in, thick and suffocating. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The whisper still echoed in my mind, the voice, so calm, so knowing, sinking into my bones. I could feel it, like a weight on my chest, pushing me forward, urging me to keep running. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. My body moved on instinct, as though my mind had abandoned me completely. I passed the neighbor's house, the trees lining the street, the quiet glow of a distant street lamp casting long shadows across the pavement. The stillness of the night was broken only by my ragged breathing and the distant hum of the city, a faint reminder that life continued elsewhere. But here, in the dark, in my own little corner of the world, I was alone. Alone with whatever was chasing me. I had to look back. I couldn't help it. My body was telling me to run, but my mind was screaming at me to know what was behind me, to confirm that it wasn't just in my head. I turned. For a split second, everything seemed normal. The street was empty, the houses lined up just as they should be. Nothing moved. Nothing was there. But then I saw it. The figure. It was standing at the edge of my yard, half hidden in the shadows, its shape indistinct but unmistakable. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its outline seemed to flicker, like a shadow cast by a light that wasn't there. I couldn't make out any details, just the faint silhouette of something, someone, watching me. I froze, my blood running cold. It didn't move, just stared. I knew, without a doubt, that it wasn't human. Panic surged through me again, but this time I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran faster, my legs burning with the effort. The house was just up ahead, the front door open, a beacon of safety, or so I told myself. I could hear it now. The footsteps. Soft, but following me, growing louder, faster. Whoever, or whatever it was right behind me. I could feel it getting closer, could almost hear its breath, warm and heavy, right at my neck. I reached the front door, but my hand shook so violently that I couldn't grasp the knob. The steps were closer now, just a heartbeat away. I turned the handle, pushed the door open with all my strength, and slammed it shut behind me. The silence hit me like a wave. I stood there, my back pressed against the door, listening. The footsteps had stopped. There was no sound now. Just the beating of my heart, pounding in my ears, and the cold sweat that had already drenched my skin. I breathed heavily, trying to steady myself, but the fear wouldn't subside. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting, as though it knew something I didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't safe. I looked around, but the house seemed unchanged. It was just as it had been before I'd gone to bed, before any of this had started. The living room was still, the same as it had always been. No sign of anyone, no movement, no signs of intrusion. But I knew better now. I couldn't shake the feeling that the danger had followed me inside. That whatever had been chasing me was now here, hidden in the shadows of my own home. I turned to the hallway. The bedroom door stood at the end of it, closed, just as I had left it. But now, it felt wrong. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if it was waiting for me to step forward. I swallowed hard, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. I didn't want to go back in there. I didn't want to face whatever had been inside. But I couldn't stay here. Not with the sense of something, someone, lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting. I walked down the hallway slowly, each step a struggle. The silence of the house was deafening. My skin prickled with every creak of the floorboards beneath me. I reached the bedroom door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. And then, I heard it again. A faint tapping, just like before. This time, though, it was coming from inside the room. It was clear now. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence. A voice, no, not a voice, but a sensation, a thought that whispered through my mind. Come in. I'd been waiting. I didn't need to hear it again. I turned and ran, straight for the door. There was no way I was staying here. I couldn't face it. I couldn't face it. The house was no longer a home. It was a trap. I didn't stop running. My feet pounded against the floor, my body moving faster than I could process, as if every instinct was screaming at me to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The house had become a maze, its walls closing in around me, its very structure warping and twisting in the dark. I reached the front door again, my heart thundering in my chest. My fingers gripped the handle, but it felt cold, too cold, like it didn't belong to the house anymore. I yanked at it, but the door wouldn't budge. It didn't open. I stepped back, eyes wide, breathing shallow and fast. The air felt thick with tension, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. I could hear the faint tapping again, this time from all around me. It was coming from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling. It was everywhere. I spun in circles, my eyes darting from corner to corner, searching for the source of the noise. But the house was empty. It should have been empty. But then I saw it. The shadow. It was there again, standing at the end of the hallway. But this time, it wasn't flickering. It was solid. A figure, tall and dark, its outline stretched unnaturally long, as if the very shadows were bending to its will. And then, it moved. I froze, unable to tear my gaze away from it. It didn't walk, didn't run. It floated, gliding silently across the floor, its form becoming clearer with every step. It was tall, far too tall, and its features were hidden in darkness, its face an abyss of emptiness. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached the doorway, and it stopped. There was no sound, no movement. Just that horrible, suffocating stillness. You should have left when you had the chance. The voice was inside my head again. Not a whisper, but a command, sharp and unyielding. I staggered backward, my legs trembling beneath me. The house seemed to stretch on forever, the walls growing taller, the shadows deeper. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could feel was the weight of that presence, pushing in on me, crushing me under its gaze. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I felt the door behind me, the door that hadn't opened before, shift. Slowly, it creaked open, the sound like the final note of a funeral dirge. It was an invitation. I didn't know what was on the other side. But I didn't care. The figure in front of me was closing in, its presence suffocating, and the door was my only chance. Without thinking, I threw myself toward it. I slammed through the opening, my body colliding with the door frame, my feet stumbling on the threshold. I didn't look back, couldn't look back. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was outside. Free. But as I stood in the cold, my chest heaving with the effort to breathe, I realized something. I wasn't alone. I looked up at the house, the one I had just fled, and saw it. The figure. The shadow. It was standing in the window, watching me. Its dark silhouette was clear now, its shape solid and undeniable. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stared. I felt my blood run cold as I understood the truth. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the shadows or the strange presence. It was me. I had brought this on myself. It had been waiting for me, for this. For my return. And now, it was following me. It was never about the house. It was about me, and I had been running from it all along. And now, there was nowhere left to run. It was a crisp evening, the kind that always made the world feel quieter than usual. The street lights flickered dimly as I stepped out for my walk, hoping to clear my head. The cool air cut through my jacket, but it wasn't enough to numb the thoughts that had been swirling around in my mind all day. I preferred the solitude of the evening. No one was around, just the faint rustling of trees, the distant hum of cars, and my own footsteps on the pavement. It was peaceful. Or at least, it should have been. But tonight, something felt off. At first, it was subtle. A slight shift in the air, maybe the way the streetlight flickered. I brushed it off. After all, there was nothing unusual about a quiet evening walk. I walked further down the familiar street, the shadows stretching long in front of me. I could hear the echo in my own steps, the sound of my shoes tapping lightly against the ground. But then, I heard it. A soft shuffle, as if someone was walking behind me. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to make me pause. I stopped and turned around, my heart starting to race. The street behind me was empty. I stood there for a moment, staring into the dim glow of the streetlights, expecting to see someone emerge from the shadows, but no one appeared. I couldn't shake the feeling, though. It was as if someone had been just a few steps behind me. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe I was imagining things. I continued walking, my pace a little quicker now, but the sound of my own footsteps felt louder somehow. I could hear them more clearly, and the air seemed colder. It was as if the world had gone quiet, too quiet, and my footsteps were the only thing breaking the silence. And then, I heard it again. A soft shuffle, like someone dragging their feet, just behind me. It was unmistakable this time. My breath caught in my throat, and I spun around once more. Nothing. The street was still empty. I stared into the darkness, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't explain it. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I quickened my pace, the sounds of my own footsteps echoing in my ears. I tried to ignore the growing panic rising in my chest, but the feeling of being followed refused to let go. I glanced over my shoulder again. There was still no one there. But then, a cold gust of wind blew through, and I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, perfectly in sync with mine. They were right behind me, so close that I could almost feel the presence of whoever was following. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The footsteps didn't stop, they were still there, matching my every move. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, trying to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted, and the silence around me seemed to amplify the sound of those footsteps. I turned again, this time quicker, almost desperate to catch a glimpse of whatever was following me. The street was still empty. No one was there. But the footsteps, they were still there. I could feel them. The panic began to rise in my chest, and I broke into a jog. The faster I went, the closer the footsteps seemed to get. I couldn't outrun them. I could feel them, just behind me, as if they were waiting for me to stop, to let my guard down. And then, I heard something else. A voice. A whisper, soft but clear, like someone was speaking directly into my ear. Don't run. My heart stopped. I spun around, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but there was no one there. The footsteps had stopped. The voice was gone, but the feeling remained. I had to get out of there. Fast. The street, once so familiar, now felt like a maze. The shadows stretched too far, and the silence was deafening. I couldn't stop. Every step felt heavier than the last, and the panic clawed at my mind, pushing me to run faster. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, louder than anything else. I glanced over my shoulder again. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched, of being followed, it never left. I kept running, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder, trying to escape the dread that gripped my chest. The streetlights blurred past me, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch and reach out like dark hands. The emptiness of the street was suffocating, and I could still hear the soft shuffle of footsteps just behind me. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing. No figure. No movement. Just the endless stretch of asphalt disappearing into the night. But the footsteps kept pace with me. I could feel them, each one echoing in my ears like a slow, deliberate countdown. Why wasn't anyone else around? Why hadn't I seen anyone else on this street all evening? It didn't make sense. The neighborhood was never this quiet. I tried to think rationally. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe the wind or the rustling leaves had made it sound like footsteps. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I knew the truth. Someone or something was following me. As I turned the corner, I spotted my street up ahead. My house was just a few blocks away. The familiar sight of the building should have been comforting, but all I could feel was the increasing dread. The footsteps were louder now. Almost too loud. Too real. It was as if they were closing in on me, getting closer with every step. I dared a quick glance over my shoulder, but once again, there was nothing. My breath hitched in my throat as I started to slow down. What was I doing? Why was I running? The street was still empty. Nothing had changed. And then, the ground beneath me shifted. I stumbled, my ankle catching on an uneven crack in the pavement. My heart skipped a beat as I caught myself against the lamppost. I stayed still for a moment, trying to calm my racing pulse. The footsteps had stopped again, but that wasn't what had made me freeze. It was the sudden, sharp sound of breathing. Slow, heavy breaths coming from just behind me. I spun around, panic flooding my veins, but there was still nothing. The street was empty. But the breathing, it was real. I could feel it. It was too close. I could hear it now, not just behind me, but all around me. It seemed to echo in my skull, each breath a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I backed up slowly, my mind racing, desperately searching for any explanation. And then, through the darkness, I saw something. A shadow moving against the grain of the street. It was too tall, too long, and yet it didn't make a sound as it shifted closer to me. I froze again, my body paralyzed by the sight. It wasn't human. The shape in the shadow was impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its body too thin. And its face, it had no face. Just an empty void where eyes should have been, an absence of everything that should have been there. The cold in the air intensified, seeping into my bones, making it hard to breathe. The shadow shifted closer, and I could hear that breath again, more distinct now, more real than ever. "Please," I whispered, though I didn't know who I was speaking to. But the figure didn't stop. It never stopped. It didn't need to. And then, just as I thought I might pass out from the weight of my fear, the ground beneath me seemed to give way. The street around me began to blur, the lights dimming, as if the world itself was crumbling under the weight of whatever was closing in on me. I turned, desperate to escape, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as though the pavement had turned to stone, locking me in place. I couldn't run anymore. The figure was almost upon me now, and I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating. It didn't make a sound as it loomed over me, its form stretching taller, narrowing until it was a single, oppressive silhouette in my vision. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight. But my body refused to obey. I was frozen, and the terror was overwhelming, consuming me whole. And then, the world went silent. The breathing stopped. The footsteps stopped. The figure stopped. I was left standing there, heart pounding in my chest, paralyzed by fear, unable to move or think. But it didn't matter anymore, because I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I had become a part of it. The shadow, the footsteps, the breath. It was all inside me now. The quiet steps had claimed me. I don't know how much time passed after that moment, or if time even mattered anymore. Everything felt different. The world around me was distorted, like the air had thickened and turned to glass. I couldn't breathe properly. My chest felt tight, and I realized that I was still standing in the same spot, but somehow, I wasn't sure how I got there. My legs were stiff, my body numb. I felt like I was caught between the present and something else, something darker. The street lights had gone out. The darkness wasn't the same as it had been before. It was deeper, colder, as if it had weight. I could still hear the breathing, but it was inside my head now, a slow, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo from every corner of my mind. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it was futile. The sound was relentless. "Stop," I whispered to myself, but my voice felt foreign, like it didn't belong. I forced myself to move. My legs protested as I took a shaky step forward, then another. The street seemed to stretch further and further, as though the distance between me and the end of the road was growing. Each step felt heavier than the last, each one sinking deeper into the silence that surrounded me. The air was thick, and the faint scent of something unnatural, almost metallic, clung to it. The further I walked, the more distorted the world around me became. I could no longer see the outlines of the houses clearly. Their windows were dark, and their shapes were barely distinguishable in the oppressive blackness. I glanced over my shoulder again. The street was still empty, but I could feel it. I could feel the presence, the pressure, the sensation of something or someone just behind me. I wasn't alone. I could hear it now, soft, shuffling footsteps, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. They were there, just out of sight, but I could feel them. My heart rate quickened, and I forced myself to focus. This was real. I had to stay focused. I had to keep moving. But then, the whisper came again. "Don't run." The voice was clear now, right in my ear. Cold. Distant. But it felt like it was inside my skull, pressing against my thoughts. I froze. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The steps, those shuffling, dragging steps, they were closer now. They were right behind me, and I could feel the cold breath of whatever was following me on the back of my neck. My body was trembling, but I couldn't move. And then, the whispers intensified, not just one voice now, but dozens. They came from every direction, swirling around me like 1,000 faint voices, too quiet to understand, but too loud to ignore. "You can't escape. Don't look back." The voices echoed in my ears, growing louder, more urgent. I turned my head slowly, terrified to see what was there. But when I looked behind me, there was still nothing, just the dark, empty street stretching endlessly into the night. My breath was ragged now, a panicked rhythm that matched the footsteps. They were getting closer, and the more I focused on them, the clearer they became. It was as if the sound of the footsteps wasn't just in the world around me anymore. It was in my mind, in my bones. I felt it in my chest, that cold, suffocating grip. The presence that had been following me, it wasn't just walking anymore. It was closing in from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. I stopped too, my legs shaking uncontrollably. The silence was overwhelming, oppressive. But the fear wasn't gone. If anything, it had intensified, and my mind was spiraling. The street around me seemed to grow darker, the shadows pressing in from all angles. My eyes scanned the road, the houses, the empty space between the lampposts. There was nothing. But I felt that I wasn't alone. It was only a matter of time before the ground beneath me trembled. A low, grating sound rumbled through the pavement, like something shifting beneath the earth. The air grew even colder, the chill seeping deep into my skin. The footsteps started again, but this time they were no longer shuffling. They were running. Closer. Faster. Relentless. I spun around, panic rising, my pulse roaring in my ears, but again, I saw nothing. Just the endless street. The shadows were too deep, too heavy to make sense of. But the footsteps were undeniable. I was being hunted. The space around me seemed to warp, the distance stretching impossibly long. Each step I took felt as if I were running in place. No matter how fast I moved, it was as if the end of the road was forever out of reach. The shuffling stopped for a moment. And then, there it was. The unmistakable sound of something, or someone, breathing right beside me. I turned, terrified of what I might see, but I couldn't bring myself to look. The breath was too close. Too real. It was time to run. But the shadows were already closing in. I ran, my legs pushing me faster than I thought possible, my heart hammering against my ribcage like it wanted to escape. The sound of my footsteps was drowned by the pounding of something behind me, something that was far too close, far too real. But as I ran, the street seemed to stretch farther than it ever had before. Each step should have brought me closer to safety, but instead, I felt as if the world was folding in on itself. The houses blurred by, their outlines indistinguishable in the dark, and the streetlights flickered overhead, casting harsh, uneven shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. It wasn't just the footsteps that haunted me now. It was the air itself seemed to thicken, heavy with the weight of something unnatural. I couldn't explain it, but the silence between each footstep felt like it was closing in around me, trapping me in some kind of suffocating bubble. I glanced behind me once more, the terror rising in my throat. The figure was there. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs stretching at angles that didn't belong to anything human. The shadow's form was so warped, so unnatural, it didn't even seem to be moving like it should. Its shape flickered in and out of the dark, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. The face, it was just a void, a deep, inky blackness that swallowed the light. I could feel its gaze, even if I couldn't see its eyes. It was as if it was already inside my mind, watching, waiting. The footsteps quickened. The figure moved with an unnatural speed, its limbs stretching out, its form twisting, chasing me with an almost calculated precision. I couldn't outrun it. I was running blindly now, my mind a whirl of panic and confusion. The world around me seemed to lose all sense of reality. The street didn't feel like it belonged to the same place I had walked earlier. The pavement felt uneven, like it was shifting beneath my feet. The streetlights flickered, their dull glow casting eerie shadows that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the beating of my heart. I could hear the whispers again, clear this time. They were no longer just in my head, they were surrounding me, swirling in the air. They were voices, dozens of them, each one indistinguishable from the others. Some were low, like a growl, others high-pitched, like a hiss. All of them were saying the same thing. Don't look back. But it was too late. My body refused to obey. I turned around, and there it was, standing at the edge of the light, its form stretching further than it should have. It was right behind me now. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The shadow loomed, its presence so overwhelming that I could feel it pressing against my chest, choking the air from my lungs. I wanted to scream, to shout, to fight, but no sound came. My mouth was dry, my legs locked in place. The world seemed to close in around me, the darkness swallowing the street, the houses, the very air itself. All that remained was the figure, stretching, moving in unnatural ways, growing taller, thinner, until I thought it would swallow the entire world. The whispering voices grew louder. Don't run. You can't escape. I took a step back, my mind clouded with fear. But the ground beneath me shifted again. This time, it wasn't just the pavement. It felt like the earth itself was twisting, pulling me down. My feet sank as if the ground were swallowing me whole. I tried to move, but my body refused to cooperate. I was stuck. And then, the figure moved closer. Its limbs stretched forward, impossibly long, reaching for me with an elongated hand. It was too close now. I could feel the chill of its presence seeping into my skin, the cold of its touch pressing against my soul. The darkness around me deepened, and the whispers became screams. No! I shouted, finally able to make sound, but it was as if the noise was swallowed by the void. The hand was almost upon me, and I knew that if it touched me, there would be no escaping it. But just as I was about to collapse, to give in to the overwhelming terror, there was a flash of light. A single, bright beam that cut through the darkness. I blinked, confused. Was I dreaming? The light was blinding, so much so that I had to shield my eyes. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. The street was silent once more. I was standing in the same place, trembling, my mind racing. My breath came in short gasps, my heart still pounding in my chest. The air had returned to normal, and the oppressive weight that had hung over me was gone. But I knew it hadn't truly disappeared. The figure was still out there, waiting, watching. I turned, unsure if I was still caught in some twisted nightmare. But the street was empty. No shadow. No footsteps. No whispers. The silence was maddening. It felt wrong. The quiet was just as suffocating as the terror I had felt moments before. I had survived, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe, not yet. Not ever again. I stood still, unable to move. My body was shaking violently, my heart thundering in my chest as I desperately tried to catch my breath. It was as if my lungs had forgotten how to function after the terror I just experienced. The street was still empty. The shadow, the footsteps, the cold whispers, they were gone. Or were they? I looked around, my eyes scanning the street, the houses that loomed on either side of me. They looked the same as they always had, familiar, comforting even, but now they felt alien, twisted in a way that I couldn't explain. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, jagged shadows that stretched far longer than they should have. There was a strange stillness in the air, almost as if the world itself was holding its breath. I could feel something watching me, something unseen, waiting for me to make the wrong move. The footsteps were gone. The figure was gone. But that didn't mean I was safe. I could still feel it. That cold weight pressing against me, like the presence of something that had never truly left. The fear gnawed at the edges of my mind, turning each passing second into an eternity. The silence was no comfort. It felt wrong, unnatural. I started walking again, my steps unsteady, as if my feet didn't quite belong to me. I had to get home. I had to make it back to some sense of safety, some shred of normalcy. But the closer I got to my house, the more the air seemed to grow heavier, thicker. The familiar street had transformed into something far more menacing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me. I could almost hear it, the soft scrape of footsteps in the distance. Each step I took made the sound louder, more distinct. But when I turned around, there was nothing. Just the empty street, the shadows of the houses stretching out in the pale light. I stopped again, my body frozen in place. No footsteps. But then, just as quickly as the silence had settled in, the whispering began again. "Don't stop." I froze, my blood turning to ice at the sound of the voice. It wasn't in my head this time. It was coming from behind me, soft, like a breath against my ear, too close. I dared not turn around. I couldn't. "Don't stop." The voice came again, clearer now, more insistent. I took a step forward, then another, my legs moving on their own, driven by pure terror. But no matter how fast I walked, the whispering kept pace. "Don't stop." I felt the presence again, just behind me, always there, always just out of view. The footsteps were real now, their soft, measured pace right behind me. The breath against my neck, cold and damp, sending chills down my spine. I forced myself to turn, but the street was empty. I saw nothing. Just the cold, empty darkness stretching before me. The house was only a few steps away now. I could see the outline of the front door, the warm light of my living room glowing faintly through the window. But even as I approached, I knew it wouldn't be the end. I could hear it. The breathing, the footsteps, the whispers. They had never left. They were only waiting for me to think I was safe. I reached for the door, my hand shaking as I grasped the cold handle, but just as I was about to turn it, the ground shifted again beneath me. The darkness seemed to swallow the street in an instant. The once familiar outline of my house melted away into a void of black nothingness. The lights in my living room flickered and then vanished entirely, replaced by a terrifying emptiness. I stumbled back, heart racing, terror exploding in my chest as the shadows moved. The ground beneath me felt soft, like wet clay, and I realized I was sinking into it, the pavement pulling me down. The whispers were all around me now, so close I could feel them in my skin. And then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Soft at first, then louder, more deliberate, getting closer. I looked down at my feet, where the pavement was beginning to give way, opening up like a mouth. I wasn't alone. The figure was there. Not in the distance this time. No, it was right in front of me, standing in the doorway to my house. It was waiting. Its dark, faceless form looming in the shadows, reaching out with its long, distorted arms. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, paralyzed with fear. The shadow was upon me, its cold breath brushing against my face as its hands reached out. I felt its fingers close around my wrist, icy cold and unyielding. "You're mine now," it whispered, its voice a distorted echo, a breath of wind that cut through my bones. I tried to pull away, but the grip was too strong. The darkness seemed to swallow me whole, pulling me into its void. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was trapped, stuck between the world I had known and the terror that now consumed me. The shadow was a part of me, a part of my very soul. And I realized, too late, that there was no escaping it. The footsteps, the whispers, the presence, they had been with me all along. And now, they were taking me down into the darkness. I was no longer running. I was being pulled deeper and deeper into its grip. The shadow had claimed me. I couldn't move. The darkness wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket, pressing in from every side. The grip on my wrist tightened, pulling me closer to that void. The figure in front of me, the one I had been running from, the one that had followed me, tormented me, was all around me now. Its presence was so overwhelming, I couldn't remember who I was, where I had been, or what had even been real. "You're mine now," the voice whispered again, but this time it felt like the words were pouring directly into my skull, not just echoing around me. The cold touch of the figure's hands felt like they were digging into my soul. I tried to scream, to fight, but my body wouldn't respond. Every ounce of fear, every shred of panic that had been building up inside me for what felt like days, no, years, was now trapped within me, suffocating me even more than the shadow itself. The air felt thick, suffused with an unnatural chill. My legs buckled beneath me, but the grip on my wrist held me upright, dragging me toward the center of the darkness. The ground had given way entirely now. There was no more street, no more pavement, just a black void, a yawning chasm that seemed to consume all light, all sound, all sense. And then I heard something else. A faint, far-off sound, like soft footsteps, not my own. They were different this time, almost familiar. I blinked, confused, my mind desperately grasping for something, anything, that could break this nightmare. The footsteps grew closer, echoing through the void like a distant memory. A shadow, a dark shape, appeared at the edge of the darkness. It was small, almost insignificant at first, but as it grew nearer, I realized it was not alone. The figure that had been chasing me, it was not the only one. There were others, many of them. Faces, twisted and distorted, flickering in and out of existence like broken reflections in a cracked mirror. Some seemed to whisper. Others stared at me, their hollow eyes empty of any human warmth. But they were all the same, they were the lost, the ones who had been taken before me. The shadow that held me began to change. It pulsed, rippled, as if the darkness itself was alive, feeding off my fear. The grip loosened slightly, and I stumbled forward, but before I could escape, I felt another cold hand close around my other wrist, pulling me back. "No," I managed to whisper, my voice hoarse, the word barely escaping my lips. But the hands didn't stop. They kept pulling me forward, deeper into the shadow. The footsteps grew louder, their rhythmic pounding matching the frantic beat of my heart. It felt like I was moving in slow motion, the world around me spinning, stretching, twisting. I closed my eyes, unwilling to look at the faces that loomed closer. But I could feel them, their cold eyes on me, their whispers crawling under my skin. And then, the hands pulled me to the center of it all. The void seemed to open up further, its edges stretching like a mouth about to swallow me whole. I was standing there, trapped, surrounded by the distorted figures, the cold whispers, the endless footsteps. The shadow that had been pursuing me for so long finally spoke again, but this time, the words were not just in my head. They were all around me, coming from the figures, from the dark, from the very air itself. "You never left." The realization hit me like a wave. I hadn't been running from the shadow. I hadn't been running from anything real. No. I had been running from myself. From the thing inside me, the fear, the darkness that had always been there, waiting. I had been chasing it. And it had always been chasing me. The shadow twisted and writhed, its form expanding, swallowing up the last sliver of light. The air grew heavier still, suffocating, the pressure unbearable. I could feel the darkness pressing into every part of me, filling me up with its cold. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but no sound came. My body had betrayed me. It had given into the darkness long before I even realized it. And then it all stopped. The whispers, the footsteps, the oppressive grip. For a moment, there was silence. But it wasn't the silence of safety, it was the silence of absence, of nothingness. I opened my eyes. I was back on the street. The pavement beneath my feet felt solid again, the familiar outlines of the houses standing tall on either side. The street lights above me flickered, but they were nothing like they had been before, flickering, dim, almost lifeless. It felt too quiet now, too still. But as I looked down the road, I saw the shadow again. It was far in the distance, far enough that it couldn't touch me. But it was there, watching, waiting. The footsteps had stopped, but I knew they would start again soon. It started innocently enough. Just a simple oddity, something I first dismissed as coincidence. It was always 22:17. Every night. No matter what I was doing, reading, watching TV, or even just sitting in silence, the hands of the clock would stop at exactly 22:17. The second hand would freeze, the minute hand and hour hand would align, and for a brief moment, the world would stop with it. At first, I didn't think much of it. A quirk of the old clock, maybe. It had been in my family for years, a small, worn thing that hung on the wall of my living room. Nothing fancy, just an old, dependable relic from a time before digital watches and smartphones. But then it started to get strange. I began to notice that the air around me would shift at 22:17. It wasn't anything that could be explained logically, but the temperature would drop just a few degrees. A chill would spread through the room, subtle but undeniable. Sometimes I would hear the faintest creak in the floorboards or the rustle of something moving in the house, though I knew I was alone. The clock would remain still, frozen in time, and I'd get this feeling, this prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. The first few times I tried to shrug it off. It's just an old house, I told myself. Maybe there's a draft. But then it happened again and again. Each night, at 22:17, the air would shift. The same quiet sounds, footsteps, a knock, a whisper, would echo faintly through the house. And then, the worst part came. One night, as the clock froze at 22:17, I heard something that wasn't there before. A sound. A knock. Light, hesitant, almost like someone was testing the door. It came from the front of the house, just beyond the hall. I paused, holding my breath. It was almost as though the knock was coming from inside my head, but the sound was clear, distinct. Knock. 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 My heart skipped. I felt a knot form in my stomach. No one was supposed to be here. I hadn't been expecting anyone. My family was all out of town, and I hadn't invited any friends over. So who, or what, was at the door? I tried to convince myself it was nothing. A neighbor, perhaps? A late delivery? But then I remembered the strange coincidence. Every night, at 22:17, something unsettling happened. Was this connected? Was this just another part of the pattern? I stood frozen for a moment, listening. The knock came again, this time louder. More urgent. I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to open that door. But I had to. The curiosity was eating at me. I felt like I had no choice. I rose from the chair, my feet heavy, my thoughts racing. I walked slowly to the front door, my breath shallow. I could feel the tension building, the weight of anticipation pressing down on me. The house was eerily quiet now, the knock seemingly forgotten. It was as if everything was holding its breath. My fingers brushed against the cold doorknob. For a moment, I hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, I turned the handle. The door creaked open, slowly, inch by inch. And there was nothing. The empty, darkened porch stretched out before me, the faint glow of the streetlight casting long shadows across the steps. No one was there. No packages. No visitors. I stepped out onto the porch, looking around. The street was quiet. Too quiet. I could feel the strange weight of the silence pressing on me. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't place. And then I heard it again. A faint whisper, so soft I almost missed it. Come back. It was barely audible, like a breath against my ear. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around, my heart pounding, my eyes darting back to the open door. But there was nothing there. Nothing at all. The clock, I realized, had started ticking again. The second hand was moving, the minute hand creeping toward the next hour. It was 22:18 now. Just 1 minute past the hour. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something was different now. I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me. The house felt colder than before, the walls pressing in on me. It was as though something had followed me in. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Watching. Waiting. I tried to calm myself down. There had to be an explanation, right? Maybe it was just the wind or my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. The clock, the knock, the whisper, these weren't coincidences. There was something else going on, something I couldn't quite grasp, but it was real. And now, I couldn't shake the feeling that time wasn't on my side anymore. The next few days felt off. It wasn't that anything had changed outwardly, but something in the atmosphere had. I could feel it when I woke up, and it only grew stronger as the day wore on. It was like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. And I could sense that it wasn't going to wait much longer. I tried to go about my daily routine. I did my work, made meals, watched the news, anything to keep my mind occupied. But every time I passed the clock, I couldn't help but glance at it, expecting it. 22:17. I could feel the clock's presence in the room even while I wasn't looking at it. I told myself it was all in my head. I had read somewhere that our brains are wired to find patterns even when none exist. Maybe I was just hyper-aware of the time. Maybe the strange occurrences were nothing more than coincidence. Maybe. But I couldn't ignore the way the temperature in the house shifted every evening. It wasn't just a cold draft or the air conditioning kicking on, it was something more. It was as if the very walls of the house themselves were growing still, waiting for something to happen. And then, on the fifth night, it happened again. At 22:17, the clock froze. I didn't even have to look at it. I could feel it, the same way you feel the ground beneath your feet. I could feel the air go still, like everything in the room was holding its breath. I had just sat down on the couch, my mind racing with thoughts of the previous days. The knock at the door, the strange whisper. What did it all mean? Was I just imagining things? Or was something more sinister at play? Then I heard it. A faint creak from the hallway, followed by a soft shuffle. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare move. Was it the house settling? Or was something, or someone, really moving through the halls? My heart pounded in my chest, the sound loud in my ears. The shuffle grew louder, closer. I could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, dragging along the floor. My body tensed. My mind raced with the possibilities. I slowly turned my head toward the hallway. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow darker, more pronounced. I couldn't tell if it was my imagination or if the darkness was truly deepening. But I didn't want to look. The footsteps stopped. Just like that. Silence fell over the house. I sat motionless, my breath shallow, straining to hear anything. The seconds felt like hours. Then, I heard it again, the knock. Soft, persistent, at the door. But this time, it wasn't the same light tap I had heard the first time. This was heavier, more forceful. It rattled the doorframe, sending a jolt of fear through my body. My eyes darted to the clock. 22:17. The second hand was frozen again, stuck in place. There was no escaping it. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The knock had come again, just like before, right on time. But this time, something in me snapped. The feeling of dread that had been creeping up for days, something I had been trying to deny, was suddenly too real to ignore. I had to face it. I had to know what was happening. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky, my mind racing with every possible explanation. There had to be a logical reason for this. It couldn't be supernatural. There was no such thing. But the whisper, the knock, it was all too specific, too precise. And now, it was happening again. I walked cautiously toward the door. The house felt too quiet now, too empty, like the world outside had vanished entirely. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. The door was just a few steps away, but each step felt like it took an eternity. As I reached for the door, the temperature in the house dropped. I could see my breath in the air, white and cold, like winter had settled inside the walls. My hand shook as I gripped the doorknob. I turned it. The door creaked open. Nothing. The porch was empty. The street lights outside cast a cold, uninviting glow onto the quiet street, but no one was there. The house across the street had its lights on, but there was no movement. No cars. No people. Just silence. But then, I noticed something. The air felt thick, oppressive. My eyes skimmed the empty porch, and that's why I saw it. A shadow, flickering, just beyond the edge of the light. It wasn't the shadow of a person or a tree. It was different, unnatural, shifting like smoke. I stepped forward, my body trembling with a mix of fear and curiosity. The shadow moved with me, staying just out of the light. It seemed to dance, stretching in ways that made no sense, warping and twisting like it had no solid form. It wasn't right. I stepped back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking, and I felt a cold sweat break out along my spine. The clock, still frozen at 22:17, hadn't moved. But now, It felt like it was watching me. The house seemed to press in around me, the walls tightening like they were closing in. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain. The knock had come again. And this time, it wasn't just a coincidence. It was something else. Something that had been waiting. Something that knew exactly when to come. Something I couldn't escape. The silence in the house was suffocating. I tried to steady my breathing, but it was difficult, as if the air itself was thick with an oppressive force that wouldn't let go. I felt as though the walls were pressing in on me, the very house holding me in place, trapping me in its unnatural stillness. The clock. It hadn't moved. 22:17. The time was frozen. I wanted to sit down, to pull myself together, but my legs felt like jelly. Every part of me wanted to run, to escape, but where would I go? The house was the only place I had. I was alone, except for whatever waited just outside that door. That shadow, flickering just beyond the light, was still vivid in my mind. It wasn't a trick of the eyes. It was real, or at least, it felt real. I could almost feel the weight of it, pressing down on me from all sides. I had to know what it was, what was happening. But a voice deep inside told me not to go back to the door, that opening it would be a mistake. I had never been a superstitious person. I had never believed in ghosts or anything paranormal. But there was something in the air, something heavy, that I couldn't explain. It was as if the world had tilted just slightly, and everything that was once familiar had become wrong. My eyes kept darting back to the clock, as though by simply looking at it, I could make sense of the madness. But the hand stayed frozen. 22:17. The same time, every night. The same knock. The same whisper. I couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't just coincidence. It was a pattern, one that I couldn't break. I started pacing, trying to clear my mind, trying to make sense of it all. But every step I took felt like I was walking through molasses. The house was unnaturally still. The usual hum of the refrigerator or the soft creaks of the house settling were gone. It was like everything had gone silent in anticipation of something. And then it came again. A soft shuffle from the hallway. It was faint at first, like footsteps on carpet, but there was no mistaking it now. It was getting closer. I froze, my blood running cold. This time, it wasn't just the usual creak. This was deliberate, like someone was moving closer and closer through the house, step by step. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. My feet were glued to the floor, paralyzed with fear. The footsteps echoed louder now, unmistakable and distinct. They came from the same hallway where I had heard them before. But this time, they weren't stopping. They were getting closer, closer to where I stood, rooted in place. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, like a door slamming open somewhere in the house. My head snapped toward the sound, but everything was still. The hallway was empty. The shadows shifted and stretched across the walls, but there was no one there. I turned back to the clock. It was still frozen at 22:17. But now, the hand seemed to mock me, as if time itself had become something I couldn't escape. And then, the knock. It was louder this time. More forceful. It rattled the door with such intensity that the whole frame trembled. It wasn't a light tap anymore. It was a demand. A presence, real, unmistakable, on the other side of that door. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I didn't want to open the door, but the pressure, the pull, was overwhelming. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay away, to lock the door and hide. But something inside me said I had no choice. I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking uncontrollably. I could feel the cold emanating from the wood, as if the door itself had been frozen in place, waiting for me to open it. My heart was hammering in my chest. The pressure in the room was unbearable now. I twisted the knob. The door opened slowly, almost unwillingly, as if something was trying to keep it shut. The air was so cold now that I could see my breath hanging in front of me like a cloud. I stepped out onto the porch, but it was just as empty as before. The streetlights cast their dim glow, illuminating the empty road, the shadows stretching long and thin across the pavement. But then I saw it again. That flickering shadow. It wasn't on the porch this time. It was further down the street, near the old gate where the alley began. But this time, it was different. It was moving toward me. It wasn't a person. It was something else, something far darker, far more sinister. It seemed to shift and sway with an unnatural grace, twisting in and out of the shadows, never fully revealing its form. But it was coming closer, slowly, steadily. I tried to slam the door, but the shadow was moving so fast now. It was almost at my doorstep. I could hear the soft rustling of its movement, the air around it trembling. My heart was pounding so loud in my ears that it drowned out everything else. I shut the door quickly, and the moment it clicked into place, the house went eerily quiet again. But I knew the shadow was still there. I could feel it, pressing up against the walls, its cold fingers scraping at the edges of the house. The clock ticked again, but it didn't matter anymore. The door was locked, and the shadow was outside. For now. But I knew it would come back. I wasn't alone in this house anymore. Something had crossed the threshold. Something was waiting for me. And I didn't know how to stop it. I sat on the floor, my back pressed against the door. The house felt like a cage, and the air around me was thick with an unease I couldn't shake. It wasn't just a presence outside, it was inside too. The house was different, as though it had transformed into something foreign, something unrecognizable. I had to get a grip, I told myself. There had to be an explanation, something logical. I couldn't let fear completely take over. But every corner of the house felt wrong. The walls seemed closer, like they were leaning in, watching me. And the silence was deafening. I hadn't heard the usual sounds of the house, the creaks, the hums, the soft whispers of old wood settling. Now, there was only a suffocating stillness that pressed in from all sides. I glanced at the clock again. 22:17. The second hand hadn't moved, still frozen in place, mocking me with its stillness. It was impossible. I could no longer convince myself it was a coincidence. I stood up slowly, my body stiff and reluctant to move. The room felt colder now, the chill seeping into my bones, as though the very air itself had been drained of warmth. I tried to shake the dread that clung to me like a second skin, but it was useless. I could feel it in my gut, a gnawing sensation that something was coming, something was watching me, waiting. The knock. The shadow. The cold. It was all connected, and I had no idea what to do about it. I needed answers. But where could I find them? The sudden creak of floorboards snapped me out of my thoughts. My breath hitched. I turned toward the sound, but the hallway was still dark, empty. It had come from deeper within the house, from the upstairs landing. The unmistakable sound of someone, or something moving through the house. Not a creak, not the usual sound of the house settling. This was deliberate. The footsteps were slow, dragging, just like the ones I had heard before. I felt my pulse quicken, my body going rigid. I didn't want to move, but I had to know what it was. The silence was crushing, like the house was holding its breath, just waiting for me to react. I forced myself to take a step, then another, until I was standing at the bottom of the stairs. My legs were trembling, but I couldn't stop. There was no going back. I had to face whatever it was. I had to know if it was real, if this was truly happening, or if my mind had simply unraveled from all the pressure. The footsteps continued, dragging their way down the hall, getting closer. Each step echoed through the house, a slow and unnerving rhythm that was driving me to the edge. They weren't stopping. Whatever it was moving through the house, coming toward me. I stepped forward, one hand reaching out to steady myself on the railing. The temperature had dropped even further, and my breath came out in visible clouds, like I had stepped into an open freezer. It didn't make sense. There was no explanation for the cold. The house was sealed tight. There was no way for outside air to be getting in. The footsteps stopped. I froze. My entire body went still, as if the world itself had stopped turning. The silence was unbearable. It stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. Then, from upstairs, a whisper. It was faint at first, like a soft breeze brushing against my ear, but it grew louder. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was more like a hiss, like someone or something was speaking directly into my mind, but I couldn't make out the words. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave, to get out of the house, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was as if the house itself had taken hold of me, binding me to the spot. My skin was crawling, my mind spinning, trying to process what was happening, but nothing made sense. The whispering continued. I could feel it now, creeping through the walls, growing louder with each passing second. It was calling me, pulling me toward it. I couldn't resist. I had to go upstairs. I didn't want to. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, to lock the door, to leave and never look back. But the whisper, it had a hold on me. It was more than just sound, it was a compulsion, a force I couldn't fight. I climbed the stairs slowly, my feet dragging with every step, as if the weight of the house itself was pulling me down. The air was so cold now that it burned, each breath feeling like ice scraping my lungs. But I couldn't stop. The whisper was clearer now, no longer a faint rustle. It was close, too close. It came from the end of the hallway, where my bedroom was. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but the presence was there, waiting. I could feel it in every fiber of my being. I reached my bedroom door. It was ajar, just slightly, but enough to make my skin crawl. The whisper was louder now, almost urgent. It felt like a command, something that needed to be done. I pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was undisturbed, the desk untouched. But there was something else in the air. Something thick and oppressive, like the room itself was waiting for something. And then, I saw it. In the corner of the room, where the shadows were darkest, there was a figure. Not a person, not a shadow, but something in between. Its form was indistinct, a mass of shifting darkness that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like it wasn't fully real. It was watching me. I froze in place, unable to move, unable to speak. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the thing in the corner of the room, feeling its presence pushing on me from all sides. The whisper stopped, and in its place, a voice. A voice that wasn't human, that didn't belong to anything alive. A voice that spoke in a language I didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. It was calling me. I had no choice. The room seemed to close in around me, suffocating me with its silence. My mind screamed for me to leave, to turn and run, but my body refused to move. The figure in the corner didn't advance. It didn't have to. It was already here, inside my mind, inside my soul. The darkness it emitted was all-encompassing, thick like tar, and I could feel it slowly crawling through my veins, taking hold of me. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice at all, really. It was a deep, guttural sound, like a series of clicks and hisses that rumbled through the room. It didn't speak in words, it spoke in emotions, in thoughts, in fear. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It didn't move, but I felt its presence growing, filling every inch of the room. The shadows seemed to stretch out toward me, reaching like tendrils, searching for a way to pull me into its darkness. The room was getting colder. No, colder wasn't the right word. It felt as though the temperature had dropped below zero, as though the very air had frozen. My breath came in shallow bursts, and I could feel the ice spreading through my chest, my limbs freezing me in place. Every part of me screamed for escape, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness had already surrounded me. I could hear the clock again. For the first time in what felt like forever, the ticking was back. But it wasn't normal. It wasn't a gentle rhythm, a simple tick-tock. The seconds were jagged, uneven, almost like a pulse, steady, but with a kind of frantic urgency that rattled through my bones. 22:17. The same time, every night. But something was different this time. It wasn't just the clock that was frozen in time. It was me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't scream. The room, the house, the world, it was all trapped in that single moment. Time had stopped, and I was caught in its grasp, unable to break free. And then, the figure spoke. Not with words, not with sound, but with something far worse. The message it conveyed was clear. It was pulling me, drawing me closer to it. The very air seemed to warp around it, like reality itself was bending in its presence. I felt the floor beneath me shift, as if it was no longer solid, as if the ground I stood on had turned to liquid. It was as if I was being sucked into the very fabric of the house, becoming a part of it, a part of the darkness. I was no longer in control. I could feel my body moving, stepping closer to the corner, to the thing that waited there. My legs moved of their own accord, dragging me forward, step by agonizing step. I couldn't stop it. I reached out, my hand trembling, as though some invisible force was pulling it toward the figure. The closer I got, the more I felt my own identity slipping away, like I was fading into nothingness, becoming one with the darkness. The whisper returned, louder now, as though the figure was speaking directly into my mind. It wasn't a threat, not a warning. It was a promise that I couldn't refuse. "You are mine," the voice said. And though I couldn't understand the words, the meaning was unmistakable. There was no escape. Not anymore. But then, a thought flickered in my mind. A single spark of defiance. Was there a way out? Was it possible to fight back, to reclaim control? I didn't know how, but something deep inside me said I had one chance. It was then that I saw it. The clock. The second hand, now ticking normally, moving as it should. But the time was different. It wasn't 22:17 anymore. It had changed. I had one chance. In a desperate, frantic motion, I reached out, my hand smashing against the clock on the wall, pushing it with all the force I had left in me. It felt like I was shattering time itself, like I was breaking through the veil that had kept me trapped. There was a deafening crash. The clock shattered into pieces, its face splintering across the floor. For a moment, the room went completely dark. No sound, no movement. And then, the figure was gone. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my body trembling with the adrenaline of the fight. The cold was still there, but it was fading. The shadows were retreating, like the very house was breathing again. I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know if I had truly destroyed whatever it was, or if it had simply retreated, waiting for the next time. But I knew one thing for sure. The house was still alive. And it wasn't done with me yet. The clock was broken, the time lost, but the presence, the feeling of being watched, remained. I stood up, my legs weak beneath me. The house was eerily quiet again. No more footsteps, no more whispers. But I knew it wasn't over. Whatever had come for me wasn't gone for good. It would come back. It would always come back. And next time, there would be no escape. I had lived in the city all my life, but I never truly knew it. Not like I thought I did. It all started when I stumbled upon the map. It was an old thing, hidden in a drawer of my grandmother's desk. She had passed years ago, and I had been going through her things, trying to sort out memories. The map was folded neatly, though the edges had yellowed with time, and the ink had started to fade. At first glance, it seemed like any other map of the city. Familiar streets, parks, shops, and the usual grid of roads. But then I saw something strange. On the map, there were dots. Red dots. They were part of the original city plan. I ran my fingers over them, tracing the marks that seemed so deliberate, so out of place. At first, I thought they were just errors. Maybe a previous owner of the map had added them. But no, they were too precise. Too intentional. There were 6 of them, scattered throughout the city, marking streets that I knew well. But these streets, these specific places, were never the same. I had never noticed anything unusual about them. But the dots made me wonder. Curiosity got the best of me. I set out to visit these spots. It seemed like an ordinary thing to do, a walk through my own city, but there was something about it that felt wrong. I started with the nearest one, just a few blocks away. A street I knew by heart, Westbrook Avenue. The first red dot was placed at the intersection of Westbrook and Finch Street. Nothing odd at first, just a normal street corner. The usual bustle of passing cars and people, some kids playing in the park nearby. But as I stood there, a shiver ran down my spine. The air seemed colder, thinner, even though the sun was still shining. I shrugged it off. Just a trick of the mind. But as the evening wore on, strange things began to happen. I had been walking around for hours, trying to figure out the connection between these dots, when I saw a man standing at the corner of Finch Street. He was staring at me. No, not just looking, he was watching. His eyes were locked on mine with an unsettling intensity. I tried to ignore it, but as I turned the corner, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me. Every step I took, I could hear his shoes hitting the pavement behind me. I glanced over my shoulder. He wasn't there. I stopped, baffled. What had I just imagined? Then, out of nowhere, I heard it, a soft, faint whisper. Too faint to make out the words, but unmistakable. My heart raced. I had no idea who or what had whispered. There was no one around. I couldn't explain it, but the air suddenly felt thicker, heavier. I decided to leave the area, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. I had to see the next stop. It was further out, closer to the docks, on Pineview Street. The walk there seemed to take forever. The streets grew emptier, the sounds of the city fading. By the time I arrived, the street was completely deserted. It was dusk now, and the street lamps flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Pineview Street was lined with old warehouses and long-forgotten shops. It was quiet, too quiet. There was something about the place that made my skin crawl. And then I saw it. The last red dot on the map marked a large, dilapidated building just a few yards away. I approached it cautiously. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, everything was covered in dust, forgotten by time. But something caught my eye. A small, old chest at the back of the room, hidden under a pile of broken furniture. I wasn't sure why, but I was drawn to it. As I lifted the lid, a strange, metallic scent filled the air. Inside the chest was a stack of yellowed papers, old letters, and photographs. But one thing stood out, a single piece of parchment. The edges were burnt, and the papers seemed to have aged much more rapidly than the rest. I unfolded it, my hands trembling. The map. The very same map from my grandmother's desk. But there was something even more unsettling. The red dots had expanded. The streets where they appeared now had strange markings, symbols, unfamiliar and cryptic. Some of the markings looked like words, though I couldn't make them out. And then, in the bottom corner of the map, I noticed something else. The words were simple, yet chilling. Don't go to the last one. A chill ran through me. What was I even looking at? Why would it warn me like this? The map, this map, seemed alive. It was changing, shifting. I stood there for a moment, unable to comprehend what I had just discovered. And then, with a deep breath, I made the decision to follow the map all the way through. But the final location, was closer than I thought. It was right behind me. I spun around, my heart racing in my chest. There, at the edge of the room, a shadow had appeared, tall and still. It wasn't there just a moment ago. My breath hitched. I couldn't make out the figure's features, only the vague silhouette of someone or something standing motionless. I froze. The air around me had grown thick again, just like it had on Finch Street. The eerie silence wrapped around me, pressing out every side. The map felt hot in my hands, as though it were burning me. The last red, there was no denying it now. It had moved, it had followed me. I tried to step back, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The figure remained still, but I could feel its presence, watching, waiting. My thoughts spiraled. What was it? Was it real? The map, was it controlling me? I had never been one to believe in superstitions or strange occurrences, but everything felt too wrong. The map, the red dots, the whispers, the figure, I had crossed a line I couldn't return from. I wanted to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadow that was slowly moving closer. It seemed to glide silently across the floor, its form just barely visible in the dim light. And then I heard the voice. Soft, low, but unmistakably clear. You shouldn't have come here. I staggered backward, my heart pounding in my ears. The voice, it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a warning. I could feel it vibrating through my body. There was no question now. This thing, this presence, it wasn't human. It wasn't of this world. I wanted to scream, to run, but the words, "Don't go to the last one," echoed in my mind. The map, the cryptic warning, it was all leading to this moment. To this shadow. The figure took another step forward. My legs moved involuntarily, but I was paralyzed. My body wasn't listening. The shadow's form was clearer now, stretching unnaturally tall, like something that didn't belong in the same space as me. It's too late, it said again, its voice distorted, like an echo of something far older, far darker. I wanted to leave, but my feet refused to obey. I knew that if I didn't get out now, I would never be able to. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to look away from the figure. The door. The door was still there, just a few feet away. I dashed toward it, but as I reached for the handle, something icy wrapped around my wrist. I gasped, feeling the coldness seep through my skin. I jerked my hand, trying to break free, but the grip tightened. I looked down, nothing. No visible hand, no sign of what was holding me. Just an unnatural pressure. In that instant, the entire room seemed to bend, twist. The walls closed in, the shadows deepened, and I could hear the faint clicking of something. Feet? Fingers? I couldn't tell. My heart pounded louder, and every instinct screamed for me to escape. But it was too late. The lights flickered once, twice, before going out completely, plunging me into darkness. I felt the presence of the figure right behind me now. It was real. Too real. And then, the map burned through my fingers. I let go, the parchment turning to ash in my hands. The last thing I heard before everything went silent was a soft laugh, so close, it was almost inside my mind. When the lights returned, the room was empty. Silent. No figure. No map. Just me, alone. And I knew, somehow, I had become a part of the city's twisted secret. The last red dot had claimed its victim. And there was no going back. I never spoke of it again. But sometimes, when I walk through the streets, I can still feel the presence of the red dots watching me. And every time I pass that same corner, I swear I can hear footsteps behind me. Following. Waiting. The days that followed felt like they belonged to someone else. I wandered through the city as if I were trapped in a fog, the events of that night replaying in my mind. It wasn't just the shadows or the whispering voice that haunted me, it was the feeling of being seen, of being part of something I couldn't fully understand. I tried to push it away. I told myself it was just a bad dream, that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But something inside me, some nagging part of my brain, refused to let go of the reality of what I had experienced. I went back to my apartment, back to the quiet routine of my daily life. But I could feel the weight of the city around me, pressing in like a heavy cloak. The streets felt wrong, as if they had been altered in ways I couldn't see, but could certainly feel. The red dots on the map kept coming back to me, like a ticking clock I couldn't ignore. It was that evening when I saw it again. I had been walking along Rivington Street when I passed a narrow alley. At first, I thought nothing of it. The alley was dark and unremarkable, the kind of place where you might find discarded boxes or the occasional stray cat. But something about it drew my attention. I stopped in my tracks. There was a red dot on the map, right there on Rivington Street, near an old bookstore. The dot had always been faint on the map, almost indistinguishable from the other markings. But now, it was vivid in my mind. It called me, as though it knew I was watching. I stood at the entrance of the alley, staring at it, unsure whether I should move forward or turn back. My heart raced as I felt the familiar weight of dread settle into my chest. The air had grown cold, and the sounds of the street seemed to fade away, as if the world were holding its breath. I didn't want to go further. I didn't want to test fate. But I couldn't stop myself. It was as if the map had taken control of me, and I was just following its path, no matter how dangerous it seemed. I stepped into the alley. The darkness swallowed me immediately. It was so quiet, so still. I could hear the faint shuffle of my feet, the scrape of my shoes on the wet pavement. But there was something else, something I couldn't place. A feeling of being watched, of being followed. I turned a corner, and suddenly, I was no longer alone. A man stood in the alley, just a few feet away, blocking the path. He was tall, his features hidden in shadow, but I could make out his eyes, wide, gleaming, almost unnatural. He didn't speak, just stared at me. My breath caught in my throat. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering me, and then he spoke in a low, raspy voice. "You shouldn't have come." I froze. The words sent a shiver through me. It was the same morning, the same phrase I had heard in the abandoned warehouse. But this time, there was something different. The voice felt real, it felt close, as though the man standing before me had somehow stepped out of the shadows from the same realm I had encountered before. The man didn't move. His eyes locked on mine, and the longer I stood there, the more I felt like I was being pulled into something I had no control over. The alley seemed to stretch, grow longer, more suffocating. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. I could hear his footsteps following me, slow, deliberate, like he knew I wouldn't get far. But then, as I neared the end of the alley, something strange happened. The world around me seemed to shift. The street ahead, the familiar one I knew so well, was suddenly unfamiliar. The buildings were darker, older, like they had been erased from my memory. I stopped, panting, looking around, my heart pounding in my ears. I was no longer on Rivington Street. It was like I had crossed some invisible line, and now I was in a place that didn't exist in any version of the city I knew. The man had stopped chasing me. He was standing at the other end of the alley, his figure half-shadowed, half-lit by a dim street lamp. He raised his hand slowly, and I saw the red dot on his palm. "You're marked now," he said, his voice carrying across the distance. "You can't escape what's coming." I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know how to make sense of any of it. But I knew one thing for certain now. I was trapped. The map wasn't just guiding me through the city, it was shaping my reality. And whatever had marked those streets, whatever had drawn me in, it wasn't finished with me yet. I turned back the way I had come, desperate to escape, but the alley stretched even further, growing darker with every step. The streetlights flickered, their glow dimming and then bursting into shadows. "Don't go to the last one." The warning from the map echoed in my head, but it was already too late. I ran, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The alley stretched on, and with each step I took, the world around me warped. The familiar sounds of the city had vanished. The only thing I could hear now was the thudding of my heart, drowning out everything else. I turned back, but the figure, the man, was still there, standing motionless at the far end, watching. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but the city, the very streets beneath my feet, were against me. The map was controlling everything, pulling the strings of this nightmare. The alley seemed endless, but eventually, I found myself stumbling onto a busy street. The kind of place I'd walked through countless times before. Crowds bustled along the sidewalks, cars honked, and the familiar noise of the city hit me like a tidal wave. But it felt wrong. The people around me, no one looked real. Their faces were blank, expressionless, like they weren't living, just walking through some motion. They didn't acknowledge my presence. I felt as though I was moving through a dream, or worse, a nightmare. I tried to push through the crowd, desperate for normalcy, but it was like I was surrounded by walls, invisible barriers that didn't let me pass. I couldn't get any closer to the edge of the street. And then I heard it, whispers, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Words I couldn't quite make out, but they were coming from the people around me, from the mouths of the motionless figures. They were talking about me. He's marked. He can't escape. I spun around, but no one was looking at me. The faces were blank, staring ahead, ignoring me as though I was invisible. But the whispers, they were real. Panic rose in my chest. I started running again, pushing through the crowd, but nothing felt right. It wasn't the street I knew. It was some twisted version of it, like the world had been bent, altered by the force controlling it. I kept running until I hit a dead end. A tall building loomed in front of me, its windows dark, its door locked. It wasn't supposed to be here. This part of the city didn't have this building. I knew it didn't. And yet, here it was. I turned around, but the crowd had disappeared. I was alone now, standing in the middle of the street. The whispering stopped. The air grew still, but the tension in my body didn't ease. Something was coming. I glanced at my watch. It was 22:17. The time on my wrist froze, just like it had before. The same exact time. I felt the cold grip of fear wrap around my chest. It was like a countdown. A final warning. Before I could react, the door to the building in front of me creaked open. No sound. No warning. Just an invitation. I didn't want to go in. Everything in me screamed to turn around, to run. But the door had opened for me, and I knew I had to go through it. A strange compulsion, something darker than fear, was pushing me forward. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, and I was plunged into darkness. The room was silent, save for the soft echoes of my footsteps as I moved deeper into the space. I could feel the air growing colder, heavier, as though it was closing in on me. My breath came out in visible puffs, the temperature dropping with each step. And then, the light flickered on. I froze. The room was completely bare, except for a single wooden table in the center. On it, a small object, an old, worn-out compass. Its needle spun wildly, as though it didn't know which direction it should point. I walked towards it, drawn to the object like a magnet. As I reached out to touch it, a voice filled the room, low and guttural, like it was coming from the very walls themselves. It's time to choose. I jerked my hand back. The compass on the table stopped spinning and pointed directly at me. The voice was clearer now, like a whisper right next to my ear. The path you take will define you. My heart pounded in my chest. I looked around the room, searching for any sign of what was happening, any explanation. But there was nothing. Just the compass. And the overwhelming sense that I was no longer in control. The voice continued, relentless. You can walk away. But the city will claim you. Or you can follow the map. And it will take what's yours. My head spun. The map. The red dots. The warnings. All of it had led me here, to this room, to this moment. Time's up. Suddenly, the walls began to close in. The compass on the table gleamed in the dim light, its needle now pointed directly at the last red dot. The one I had ignored. The one I had avoided for so long. It was too late now. The city had already chosen for me. And I had no way out. The walls closed in tighter, and I could feel my chest constricting, the air thinning, suffocating me. I reached out for the door, but it was already gone. The room, the building, had vanished, leaving me trapped in a void where time and space had no meaning. The last thing I saw was the red dot. It glowed brighter than ever, and then everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the room. I was back in the city, at least it looked like the city. But something was off. The streets were darker than they should have been, and the buildings loomed overhead, taller, more imposing, as if they were watching me. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural quiet. I didn't know how I got here, or if I had ever left. My head pounded, and a strange feeling of dread filled me. The streets were empty, save for the dim glow of streetlights casting long, twisted shadows. The silence was suffocating. I looked down at my wrist. My watch read 22:17. The same time. I had no idea how much time had passed since I entered that room with the compass, but it didn't feel like I had been anywhere else. Had I been transported? Was this some kind of alternate reality, or was I trapped in a nightmare of my own making? I stumbled forward, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty street. The silence was so complete that it made my skin crawl. No wind, no birds, no distant hum of cars. Just silence. And then, a sound. At first, it was faint, like the distant murmur of voices, but as I walked, it grew louder, clearer. I turned toward the source. The sound was coming from an alley up ahead. I didn't want to go toward it. But someone, was calling me. I walked slowly, my breath shallow, my heart racing as the alley loomed ahead. The whispering grew louder, but I still couldn't make out the words. The closer I got, the more the alley seemed to twist and shift before my eyes, like the world around me was folding in on itself. I reached the entrance to the alley. It was dark, but not as dark as it should have been. There was a faint light coming from within, flickering like a dying flame. I stepped into the alley. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was musty, damp, like the air in an abandoned building. But as I walked further, the smell changed. It became sweeter, somehow. Like old flowers. Dead flowers. My stomach turned, and I tried not to breathe too deeply, but the air filled my lungs anyway. I turned the corner, and there it was. The red dot. It wasn't on a map this time. It was on the wall, painted in what looked like blood. The color was too vivid to be anything else. It glowed in the dim light, and I could feel its presence in my chest, like it was pulling at me. The same feeling of dread that had been building inside me intensified. I wanted to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen. Then I heard it. A voice, clear and unmistakable, came from the darkness at the end of the alley. "It's here." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wanted to scream, to turn and run, but something was stopping me. I was trapped in this moment. Trapped by the red dot. "You've been marked." I spun around, my breath coming in ragged gasps. There was no one there. The alley was empty. But the voice, it was still there, as though it was coming from all around me, inside my mind. "You can't escape what's already been decided." I shook my head, trying to shake off the voice, trying to make sense of what was happening. It was too much. The map, the compass, the red dots, none of it made sense. But the one thing that felt certain was the fact that I was being hunted. I had always been hunted. I felt the pressure in my chest again. The compulsion to move forward, to follow the red, was irresistible. I stepped closer to the wall, my hand reaching out toward the glowing spot. As soon as my fingers brushed against the blood-red paint, the world around me shifted. The ground beneath my feet cracked open, and I fell. For a moment, everything was black. I felt weightless, as though I was suspended in nothingness. And then, the world reappeared, distorted. I was in a place I didn't recognize. The streets were twisted, like a reflection in a shattered mirror. The buildings leaned at impossible angles, the sky overhead a sickly shade of green. The air was thick, pulsing with a faint hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And in the distance, I saw it, the red, hovering in midair. Larger now, brighter, as though it was calling to me, pulling me toward it. "You're here now," the voice whispered again, its tone more sinister. "This is the final choice." I tried to move, to turn away, but the world around me seemed to bend with my every movement. The ground beneath me cracked open again, swallowing everything. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't escape. The map ends here. The red dot grew larger, closer. It was no longer just a mark. It was the center of everything, the heart of this place. And as I reached out to touch it, I knew something terrible was about to happen. And then, everything went dark. I woke up, but I wasn't sure where I was. It was as if I had never truly left. My body felt heavy, like I was trapped in a dream I couldn't wake from. For a moment, I thought maybe I had died, that the red dot had led me to some kind of final resting place. But the thought was fleeting, slipping away like a half-forgotten memory. I stood up, unsteady at first, but then I noticed something. I was back in the city. The same city. But everything was wrong. The streets were still eerily quiet, but this time, the buildings around me were no longer familiar. They had changed, morphed into strange shapes that didn't belong in this world. Some buildings were misshapen, leaning unnaturally to one side, while others seemed to ripple in the air like mirages. The sky was dark, but there was no moon, no stars, just a cold, black void stretching out above me. And then I saw it. The red dot. It wasn't just a mark on a wall anymore. It was hanging in the air, just ahead of me. It pulsated, beating like a heart, drawing me toward it with a magnetic pull I couldn't resist. I moved toward it, my legs moving on their own, as though my body had already made the decision. Every step felt like a trap, but I couldn't stop. The voice was still there, whispering in the back of my mind, but it was distant now, like a memory fading into the background. "You've been here before." I tried to focus, tried to make sense of everything, but the words kept repeating themselves, echoing in my skull. "You can't escape. This is where it ends." The further I walked, the more distorted the city became. Buildings that once appeared solid began to shift and melt as if they were made of liquid. The ground beneath me cracked open again, and this time I didn't fall. I stood on the edge of something, staring down into an abyss. "The end is near," the voice whispered once more. "There's no way out." I felt the pressure again, like something was closing in around me, suffocating me. The red was now right in front of me, glowing with an unnatural light that made my skin crawl. I reached out for it, unable to stop myself. My hand brushed against the glowing sphere, and for a brief moment, everything froze. I felt it. The shift. The moment when everything would change. And then it was gone. I was back in my apartment. The room was dim, the air thick with the smell of dust and something metallic. My watch read 22:17 again, the same time it always had. I looked around, and everything seemed normal. But I knew it wasn't. The map. The red dots. The compass. Everything had led me here. To this moment. To this place. I could still feel the pull, the presence of the red dot hanging in the air like a thread I couldn't escape. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in on me, the shadows growing longer and more sinister with every passing second. I heard something. A knock. It was soft at first, tentative, but it grew louder with each strike. The sound reverberated through the walls, and I knew who it was. It had come for me. I approached the door, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. I opened it. Nothing. The hallway was empty. There were no footsteps, no figures lurking in the shadows. Just silence. But then, I noticed something. The floor beneath me had changed. The familiar carpet was gone, replaced by cold, smooth concrete. The hallway stretched on farther than it should have, the walls narrowing in like a tunnel. I was no longer in my apartment. I turned back to the door, but it wasn't the same. The door frame was warped, the edges jagged, as if reality itself had been torn open. The red was hovering in the corner of the room. I tried to move toward it, but something stopped me. I felt it, that feeling, the one that had followed me all this time. The knowledge that I had been marked. That I was being pulled into something I couldn't understand. The map had shown me the way, and now there was no turning back. I knew that, no matter what, I would never be able to escape. The red dot was all that was left. I reached out to touch it, and everything went black. It started so simply. Every evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I would see it. At first, I thought I was imagining things, that it was nothing more than a trick of the fading light or perhaps some figment of my mind, lonely after a long day. But the more I saw it, the more certain I became it was real. The black dog. It wasn't a stray, at least not in the way I usually saw them. It was larger than most dogs, with matted fur that blended into the darkness, almost like it was a part of the night itself. Each time, it stood there, near the old oak tree in my front yard, unmoving, staring at my house with eyes that seemed too aware, too intelligent for a creature that should be so ordinary. I tried not to pay it too much attention. After all, there were many dogs in the neighborhood, and maybe this one had simply found its way to my yard. But something about it, something made me uneasy. Every evening, as the shadows grew long, I would catch a glimpse of it, standing in the same spot, unblinking. I began to wonder, was it following me? Was it always there? Had I simply not noticed before? One night, I decided to sit by the window, just to see if it would return. I waited, watching the streetlights flicker to life one by one. It wasn't long before I saw it again. The black dog, standing in its usual place, its body almost blending into the growing darkness. I should have felt comforted by the fact that nothing had changed, that the dog was still just standing there. But instead, my pulse quickened. There was something unsettling about it, something that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. And then it happened. The dog, without moving its head, shifted its gaze directly to me. Through the window. Through the glass. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew it was watching me. It knew I was watching it. I wanted to look away. I tried, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if some force was keeping me in place, forcing me to hold eye contact, feeling a weight in my chest that grew heavier with every passing second. And then, as quickly as it started, it was over. The dog broke the stare, its head slowly turning to look back at the oak tree, and just like that, it turned and disappeared into the shadows. I pulled myself away from the window, my hands trembling. What was that? Why did it feel so wrong? It wasn't just a dog, I realized. It was something else. Something watching me. Something waiting. The next evening, I tried to shake off the feeling. I told myself that I was overthinking it, that I was just tired and my imagination was running wild. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The dog, its eyes, its unblinking gaze. And then it happened again. The next evening, I saw it once more. The black dog, standing in the same spot, waiting. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stood up from my chair, my heart pounding. I knew I had to do something, but what? What was it that kept bringing me back to that window? Was it the same dog? Or was it something else entirely? I felt a rising sense of dread. A part of me screamed to ignore it, to go inside and lock the door. But the part of me that couldn't look away, the part of me that was drawn to it, pushed me to go outside. I stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, the silence heavy, broken only by the distant hum of streetlights. The dog was there. But something was different. It wasn't standing still anymore. It was closer. The black dog was now just at the edge of my yard, standing at the bottom of the steps leading to my porch. Its head tilted slightly, as if studying me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I instinctively took a step back. And then, as if sensing my fear, it did something I hadn't expected. It turned and walked away. But not the way it had before. This time, it didn't go back to the oak tree. It didn't disappear into the shadows. It walked toward the road, its steps slow and deliberate, as if it wanted me to follow. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Something about this felt wrong. Very wrong. I watched, frozen, as it walked, its silhouette blending into the night. But just as it reached the edge of the yard, something shifted. the dog stopped. It looked back at me, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. For a brief, terrifying moment, I saw something else in those eyes, something that wasn't just animal. It was something older, darker. And then it was gone. I stood there for a long time, unable to move, unsure of what to do next. My heart raced, but I knew that something had changed. Something had shifted. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the dog wasn't gone at all. It had only just begun. The next day was strangely quiet. The house felt unnaturally still, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I had spent the whole night tossing and turning, haunted by the dog's eyes, the way it had looked back at me before disappearing. I kept telling myself it was just a dog, a stray, maybe, but deep down, I knew it was something more. Something I couldn't explain. I went about my day, trying to push the thoughts of the dog out of my mind. But as dusk began to fall, an unease settled in my chest. I knew it was coming. I didn't have to look at the clock to know it was time. The darkness felt heavier than usual, thick with the anticipation of something unknown. I found myself at the window again, but I didn't want to be. My eyes instinctively scanned the yard, searching for the familiar shape. It didn't take long to find it, the black dog, standing at the base of the oak tree once more, watching. This time, though, it wasn't as still as before. It paced back and forth slowly, its movements stiff and deliberate. Each step seemed measured, like it was planning something. I held my breath, my pulse quickening. It was almost as if it knew I was watching, as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. And then, without warning, the dog stopped. Its head whipped around and locked onto me, its eyes gleaming, reflecting the dim light from the street lamps. I felt a chill wash over me, something cold and deep. My body stiffened, frozen in place, as the dog didn't just stare, it seemed to look through me, as though it could see into my very soul. I stepped back from the window, heart racing. What was it? Why was it here? It didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me to do something, that this was part of something bigger, something I wasn't meant to understand. The sound of the front door creaking open broke the silence. I whirled around, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. My hand instinctively reached for the doorknob. I wasn't sure why, but I felt drawn to open it. The dog had never gotten this close before. What if I was meant to face it? I pushed the door open, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The cool night air hit my face, but the street was eerily quiet, too quiet. I hesitated on the porch, trying to steady my racing heart. Should I go out there? Should I follow the dog? I could feel the pull, the compulsion to move, to find answers. I stepped off the porch. My feet barely made a sound as I walked toward the oak tree, my gaze fixed on the spot where the dog had been. It wasn't there anymore. Had it left? Had it gone? Or was it still out there, watching me? I felt a shiver run down my spine as I glanced around. There was nothing. The street was empty, save for the shadows stretching long beneath the streetlights. I felt a flicker of hope, maybe it had finally gone. But then I heard it. A low growl. Deep. Rumbling. It came from behind me, from the dark corner of the yard near the fence. My heart jumped into my throat as I whipped around, my breath caught in my chest. There, in the shadows, was the dog again. But this time, it wasn't standing still. It was crouched, its body low to the ground, its eyes burning into mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. The dog didn't advance. It didn't move at all, other than to blink slowly, deliberately. It was like it was waiting for something, waiting for me to make the next move, to approach it. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I backed up, my mind screaming at me to run, to get inside and lock the door. But my legs felt like they were made of lead. It felt as though the dog's gaze was holding me in place, keeping me from escaping. The growl rumbled again, louder this time, and I knew it wasn't just an animal anymore. It was something else. Something that didn't belong here. And then it whimpered. The sound was soft, almost human, and it struck me like a cold wave. It was so out of place that for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. But as the noise grew louder, I realized it was real. The dog was waiting, watching, and now it was pleading. I didn't want to find out. I turned and ran. My legs finally obeyed as I bolted back toward the house, my feet pounding against the earth. My heart was in my throat, and I could feel the fear clawing at my chest as I reached the door. But as I fumbled for the doorknob, I froze. There were footprints in the dirt. Black, wet prints, each one perfectly shaped like a paw, leading straight to my front door. I quickly swung the door shut behind me, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The sound of the growl was gone, replaced by the eerie silence of the night. I turned the lock and pressed my back against the door, my eyes scanning the room, heart still racing. The house was still. Too still. And then I heard it, scratching, from the other side of the door. Slow. Steady. Scratching, as though the dog was trying to get in. The scratching continued, steady and methodical, like a clock counting down to something I wasn't ready to face. My mind raced. What was happening? Was it the dog? Or something worse? I backed away from the door, my breath shallow, barely able to control the panic clawing at me. My heart thudded in my chest as I turned, looking around the room for something, anything, that could make me feel safe. The walls felt too close, the space too small. My gaze fell on the window. I hadn't thought to check it before, but now the thought hit me. If the dog could be here, it could be anywhere. I moved to the window, as quietly as possible, trying not to make a sound. The blinds were drawn halfway, just enough to see the yard beyond. My hand trembled as I slowly pulled them back. Nothing. The yard was empty. The streetlight flickered, casting long shadows on the ground. The dog wasn't out there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier now, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The silence was deafening, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes darted around the room, desperate for any sign of movement. Then, suddenly, a sound from behind me, a soft thud, came from the direction of the door. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The scratching had stopped. But the thud, it was louder now. Something was on the other side of the door, pushing against it. I took a hesitant step back. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The dog had never come this close before. Could it really be inside? I slowly moved toward the door, barely daring to breathe. My fingers brushed against the cool metal of the handle. My heart was pounding in my chest, but my body didn't respond. I knew what I had to do. I unlocked the door, slowly, cautiously, knowing that whatever was on the other side was waiting. The door creaked open, the sound too loud in the oppressive silence. My eyes strained to make out what was there, but the hallway beyond was dark, impossibly dark. The air felt thick, heavy, pressing against me, almost suffocating. The house was never this dark, even at night. There was something wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I stepped back, ready to slam the door shut if I needed to. But just as I was about to, I heard it. A soft, almost human whisper. "Let me in." My blood ran cold. It wasn't the dog anymore. It was something else. A voice, low and hoarse, but unmistakably there. I could feel my legs shaking beneath me. The door was ajar just a sliver, but that whisper seemed to seep into every corner of the room, echoing in my mind. "Let me in." The whisper sounded closer now, coming from behind the door, as if something was waiting to step over the threshold. I hesitated, torn between running and finding out what it wanted. My heart hammered in my chest, my thoughts scrambled. What did it mean? What did it want from me? I couldn't keep standing there, frozen with fear. I had to make a decision. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the gap in the door, half expecting to see the dog's black eyes staring back at me. The whisper came again, louder this time, as if it was right there. "Let me in." Without thinking, I bolted. I slammed the door shut with all the strength I had left, the sound of it thudding through the house, shaking me to my core. I backed away, hands trembling, desperate for escape. I ran to the stairs, nearly tripping on the first step as I ascended, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The house felt like it was closing in on me, its walls pressing down, suffocating me. I reached the top and darted into my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. My breath was ragged, my mind spinning in a whirlwind of panic. I rushed to the window, pulling the blinds open wide, scanning the yard once more. Nothing. No black dog. No footprints. But there was something else. The reflection in the window. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. There, at the foot of my bed, was the black dog, staring up at me with those same burning eyes. But now, it wasn't just a dog. Its shape was more human, twisted and wrong, its body contorted unnaturally. The eyes, those eyes, were no longer just watching, they were waiting. Waiting for something, waiting for me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My limbs felt like lead, my body frozen in place. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The dog was closer now, so much closer, and I knew it was here for me. I could hear its growl, soft at first, but growing louder. And then, the whisper came again, right next to my ear. "Let me in." The whisper lingered in the air, like a cold breath on my skin, but the dog didn't move. It stood at the foot of my bed, staring at me with those empty eyes that seemed to see through me. I was paralyzed, unable to move, my chest tight with fear. My thoughts raced, each one darker than the last, each one pushing me closer to the edge of madness. Was it real? Was this some sort of nightmare I couldn't wake up from? I forced my eyes away from the dog, trying to focus on the room around me. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and the heavy weight of something unnatural. I could feel the pressure in my head, a pulse of dread beating with each passing second. The dog's growl grew deeper, rumbling from its chest like a distant thunderstorm that was getting closer with each heartbeat. And still, it didn't move. It just watched. Let me in. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something. Anything. I couldn't stay here, not with that thing, whatever it was, standing in front of me, watching, waiting. With a trembling breath, I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the floor as I sprinted toward the door, desperate for escape. But as my hand reached for the doorknob, I stopped dead in my tracks. It was gone. The room was silent. The bed was empty. The reflection in the window showed nothing but the shadow of the street lamp outside, flickering faintly. No dog. No twisted figure. I stood frozen, my hand still hovering over the doorknob, my breath coming in sharp gasps. Was it gone? Had it ever been here? Was I losing my mind? A sudden, sharp scratching noise broke the silence. I whipped around, heart pounding, every muscle tensed. The sound was coming from the window. I didn't want to look. I knew I had to, but I didn't want to see. But my eyes betrayed me, and I turned to the window. And there it was. The black dog. But it wasn't outside. It was pressed up against the glass, its nose against the pane, its eyes reflecting the faint light from the street. Its breath fogged up the glass as it stared at me, unblinking, its body shifting as if it was slowly creeping closer to me. My hand shook as I stumbled backward, my mind screaming for me to get away. The growl rumbled in my chest, deep and ominous. The dog was inside now, somehow. But how? How had it gotten in? And then, the window opened. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't moved. The glass creaked as it slid upward on its own, the wind outside rushing in, cold and biting. I felt the temperature drop in the room, a chill creeping up my spine. The dog didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, its eyes never leaving mine, its form growing larger, more menacing. I took a step back, my thoughts swirling in panic. What did it want? What was it trying to tell me? And then I heard it. Not a growl, not a bark, but a voice. A voice that was not my own. Let me in. It was louder now, coming from the dog, but it didn't sound like the dog anymore. The voice was something else. Deep, distorted, like it was coming from the pit of some dark abyss. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The voice echoed through my skull, rattling my very bones. The room seemed to pulse with the sound, each word feeling like a strike against my heart. Let me in. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, every breath like I was inhaling fire. I was suffocating, drowning in the sound of that voice. I needed to get away. I needed to escape. I turned toward the door again, but this time there was no hesitation. I didn't even look behind me. I ran. I sprinted through the house, through the dark, the walls closing in as if the house itself was alive, watching me. My feet slapped against the floor, each step echoing in the emptiness. I reached the stairs, barely able to keep my balance as I stumbled upward. Let me in. The voice followed me. Louder now. Closer. I ran to the attic door and yanked it open, nearly knocking it off its hinges. I didn't care. I slammed it shut behind me, panting for air. I was safe. At least for now. The attic was dark, but I didn't care. I collapsed on the floor, my mind spinning, my hands trembling. The dog, whatever it was, wasn't here. It couldn't be. It had to be gone. But then, the scratching came again. Soft at first, almost like it was just my imagination. But no! It was real. It was right outside the attic door. Scratching. It was slow, deliberate, methodical. As if it was taking its time, savoring the terror it was causing. And then, the whisper came again. Let me in. I held my breath, pressing my back against the wall, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The attic felt suffocating, too small. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, drowning out everything else. And then, suddenly, the scratching stopped. For a moment, there was silence. A heavy, oppressive silence. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow. Steady. Coming up the stairs. Let me in. I couldn't run anymore. There was nowhere to go. And then the door to the attic creaked open. The door creaked open, and I froze. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, each beat loud enough to shake my bones. The darkness beyond the door seemed to stretch forever, a shadow deeper than anything I'd ever seen. For a moment, I dared not breathe, afraid that even the slightest sound would bring whatever it was closer. But the footsteps, they stopped. I couldn't hear them anymore. I held my breath, straining to listen. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to move, to run, to do something. But I couldn't. It was as if I was paralyzed, unable to make my body obey my desperate thoughts. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, finally, I heard it. A low growl, barely audible but unmistakable. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, through my very soul. I clenched my fists, trying to steady myself. The dog, it was here. It had come for me. It had followed me up here, and now it was waiting. Watching. Waiting for its chance. The growl grew louder, closer, and I realized I could no longer hear the footsteps. It was standing right outside the door. I could feel its presence. The air was thick with it. It wasn't just a dog anymore. It was something other. Something ancient, primal. Something that didn't belong in this world. And then I heard the voice again. That same, distorted voice. Let me in. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a request. It was a command. And I knew, in that moment, that if I opened that door, there would be no turning back. I couldn't let it in. I couldn't let it have me. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing, trying to think of something, anything, to protect myself. The attic was bare, save for a few old boxes and dusty furniture. Nothing here would help me. No weapon, no escape. Just this room, the door, and the thing on the other side. The growl came again, louder this time, more menacing. I could hear its claws scraping against the floor. It was pacing, waiting for me to make a move. I could almost feel its eyes on me, cold, unblinking, just like before. I backed away slowly, my body trembling with fear. There was nowhere to go. I could feel the pressure of the thing outside closing in. The door was still cracked open. Let me in. The growl became a snarl, and I couldn't take it anymore. I ran. I charged toward the small window at the far end of the attic, hoping against hope that I could escape somehow, that the thing would leave me alone if I just got far enough away. But when I reached the window, it was locked. Of course, it was locked. My hands shook as I tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The dog's growl was right behind me now. I could hear it, its heavy breathing, its claws dragging against the floorboards. I could hear the scrape of its body as it moved, getting closer. I didn't know what to do. The panic swelled inside me, choking me, until I thought I might pass out. I glanced back at the door, hoping for some miracle, but the shadows on the other side of it only seemed darker. And then, the dog appeared. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was fully formed, its massive frame filling the doorway, its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. Its coat was blacker than night, its fur slick and matted. It was monstrous, larger than any dog I had ever seen, with teeth that looked sharp enough to tear through flesh. I froze. The dog didn't move. It didn't need to. It was the embodiment of fear itself. It was the shadow of every nightmare I had ever had. Its mouth opened slowly, revealing rows of teeth, and it spoke again. "Let me in." I could no longer tell if it was the dog speaking or if it was my own thoughts manifesting into a nightmare. The line between reality and horror had blurred. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the dog stepped back into the shadows, retreating into the dark. I blinked, unsure if I had imagined it. But when I looked back at the door, it was still open. The footsteps were gone. The growl had ceased. I dared to move forward, my body trembling from head to toe. The house was silent again, but the silence felt wrong, unnatural, like something was waiting to strike. I stood there in the dark attic, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The dog had spoken. The door had opened on its own. The scratching and the growls, the feeling of being hunted, none of it made sense. But it was real. I had felt it. And it wasn't done with me yet. I backed away from the door, my mind racing with dread. But just as I turned to run, a sudden thought hit me like a bolt of lightning. The dog had never been outside. All this time, I had thought it was standing outside my window, watching me. But it hadn't been. It had been inside all along, watching from the shadows. And now, it was closer than ever. I bolted toward the door, throwing it open. And I ran. As I sprinted down the stairs, the house seemed to warp around me. The walls closed in, the floorboards creaked, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of paws pounding behind me, keeping pace with every step I took. The dog was chasing me, and I couldn't escape. I could hear it in my ears now, breathing heavily, growling as it closed the distance between us. There was no way out. And then I reached the door. I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop to look back. I threw open the door and ran out into the night. But the street was empty. There was no dog. No growl. No sound at all. Just the silence. And the feeling that I was being watched. Forever. It was a quiet, almost ordinary evening when we returned from our family vacation. My husband, Daniel, had the camera in hand as we walked through the front door, me following behind with the bags, and the kids chattering about the places we'd seen. The trip had been the perfect escape, a brief pause from the usual chaos of our lives. We dropped our things in the entryway, and Daniel sat down at the kitchen table, already fiddling with the camera. "Let me just upload these photos," he said, smiling at me as if nothing was out of the ordinary. I didn't think much of it at the time, but in hindsight, I should have. The smile was too calm, too easy. He plugged the camera into the computer and began transferring the pictures. I heard the clicking of keys and the whir of the printer as he printed a few. The kids were excitedly discussing what they'd enjoyed the most: the beach, the sunsets, the ice cream, all the typical vacation memories. But then, the atmosphere changed. It was subtle at first, but something about the photos on the screen caught my attention. I leaned over Daniel's shoulder to get a closer look. There were images from the vacation, sure, pictures of the beach, the hotel, and the kids playing near the pool, but there were others, too. Dark, blurry photos of places I didn't recognize. Streets I didn't know. A bridge with water flowing beneath it, a narrow alley lit only by the faint glow of streetlights, and, strangely, an image of an old house. An old, abandoned house. Its windows dark, and the door hanging slightly ajar. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel looked at me, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "These photos, Daniel. We didn't go anywhere like this, did we?" He stared at the screen, confusion spreading across his face. "No, those aren't from the trip. I swear I didn't take these." I felt a chill run down my spine. These were clearly photos taken by our camera, but they weren't from the places we visited. They were of locations I had never seen before, never heard of. And they had been captured by our camera, while we were on the vacation. The kids were still talking, but I could no longer concentrate on their voices. I could only focus on the pictures. And the house. The old house. There was something unsettling about it. It felt wrong. Maybe the camera malfunctioned? Daniel suggested, though his voice wavered slightly, as if he too was starting to feel the unease. I shook my head. These pictures weren't taken by mistake. They looked too real. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat a slow, deliberate thud. Something wasn't right. The kids kept laughing, oblivious to the growing tension between Daniel and me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something I couldn't explain. I picked up the camera from the table and turned it over in my hands. It was still the same camera we'd used all week. No signs of malfunction, no evidence that something was wrong with it. I turned it on and scrolled through the settings, but there was nothing unusual. The pictures on the screen, though, they remained those strange, foreign locations, the dark alleyways, the eerie house. Something about them felt familiar. The way the shadows lingered in the corners of the photos, the angle of the shots, the emptiness in the scenes. As though I had seen those places before in a dream, or worse, in a nightmare. I glanced at Daniel, who was still staring at the screen, his face pale. "Where are these places?" I asked again, more urgently now. He shook his head. "I don't know. I'd never seen them. But I had. I had seen them, too. Or at least, I thought I had." A memory tugged at the back of my mind, elusive, like a faded image in a dream. There was something unsettling about the house. That abandoned, decaying house. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt drawn to it. I had to know what it was, what it meant. I turned away from the screen and hurried into the living room, trying to push the image of the house out of my mind. But it lingered, haunting me. I heard Daniel call my name from the kitchen, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. My thoughts were spinning out of control. How could those photos be on our camera? How could they show places we'd never been? Is something wrong? My daughter's voice brought me back to the present. She was standing at the door, holding a photo in her hand, her face pale. "Mom, where is this place?" I took the photo from her hands. It was another one of those images, the old house, only this time, the door was open wider. A figure stood just beyond the threshold, its face hidden in shadow. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't understand it. But deep down, I knew we weren't alone in this. Whatever was happening, whatever those photos meant, it wasn't just some glitch. It was real. And it was getting closer. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I was overreacting. After all, it was just a camera malfunction, right? A glitch. There had to be a rational explanation. But the feeling in my chest, that tight knot of unease, refused to loosen. I sat down on the couch, holding the photo of the house in my hand. The figure standing in the doorway seemed to be staring right back at me, although its features remained hidden. It was as if the darkness itself was swallowing the person whole. "Mom, what's wrong?" My daughter, Lucy, asked again, her voice laced with concern. I looked at her, trying to force a smile, but it felt fake. "Nothing, sweetie. Just tired, I guess." Daniel appeared in the doorway, his face drawn and pale. "We need to talk." I nodded, but I didn't follow him immediately. Instead, I stared at the photo again. The house, the figure, it felt like something from a long-lost memory, something that didn't belong in my life. "Kate, come on," Daniel said, his voice more urgent now. I reluctantly got up and followed him into the kitchen, where he was pacing back and forth, clearly agitated. "I don't get it," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I've never seen these places, but it's like they're familiar, you know?" I nodded. "I feel the same way. But you said it was a glitch." "I mean, why would the camera suddenly start taking pictures of places we've never been?" he asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "I don't know. It's like someone else is using the camera, or," my throat tightened, "or like we're being watched." Daniel stopped pacing and looked at me, his face turning a shade paler. "What do you mean? You think someone else is taking these photos?" I didn't know how to explain it. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like something sinister was at play. It wasn't just the pictures. There was an unease that seemed to hang in the air around us, something lurking just beyond the edges of perception. "Look," I said, my voice trembling a little, "the camera's ours. We've been the only ones who've used it. But those photos, they weren't taken by us. And that house, why do I feel like I've seen it before?" Daniel glanced at the photo in my hand. "I don't know," he said quietly, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. "But I don't like it. It feels wrong." I stared at the photo again, unable to shake the feeling that the house, the figure, whatever it was calling to me. That somehow, in some twisted way, it was a part of me now. Suddenly, a sound from the hallway startled me. The faintest of footsteps, as though someone was walking slowly across the floor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be listening, too. The house was completely still. There was no one else here. No one had entered the house while we were talking. I glanced at the door, half expecting someone to be standing there. "I didn't hear anything," Daniel said, though his voice held uncertainty. "Maybe it's just the house settling." But I knew better. This wasn't the sound of creaky floorboards. This was something different, something deliberate. And it was moving closer. I got up, my legs feeling shaky, and walked toward the hallway. The light from the living room barely reached the dark space beyond the door, casting long shadows on the walls. My pulse quickened, every nerve on high alert. "Kate, wait," Daniel started, but I ignored him. I had to know what was happening. I reached the door to the hallway and paused. The faint sound of footsteps continued, now more distinct. They weren't coming from the stairs. They were coming from the front door. The very door we had just walked through. I slowly turned the handle, my breath shallow, my mind racing. The door creaked open, revealing the entryway. The floor was bare. No one was there. But there, on the floor, right in front of the door, were fresh footprints. I stepped back, my hand shaking as I pointed to them. "Those weren't there before," I whispered, dread creeping up my spine. Daniel came up behind me, looking down at the prints. They lead outside," he said quietly. "But why are they here? And why do they stop at the door?" The footprints were clearly visible, muddy and fresh, but they didn't go anywhere. They simply stopped at the entrance, as if someone, or something, had stood there, waiting. "Do you think it's related to the photos?" Daniel asked, his voice tense with anxiety. I didn't know how to answer. The air felt thick with something I couldn't explain. Something that had been building since we arrived home. Something that was waiting just outside the door, or worse, inside with us. I didn't want to think it. I didn't want to believe it. But I could feel it deep down in my bones. The photos weren't just photos. The footsteps weren't just a sound. This wasn't some glitch. This was something real. Something that had come with us. And it wasn't done yet. The prints on the floor seemed to haunt me, as though they were a sign, something that couldn't be ignored. I stood frozen at the door, staring at them, my heart thundering in my chest. My mind raced, trying to find a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was just mud from the outside, maybe someone had been walking by, but the sensation in my gut told me otherwise. Daniel was beside me now, his face pale as he glanced down at the footprints, then back at me. "What do we do?" His voice was barely a whisper, the fear evident in his eyes. "We need to find out where they came from," I said, though I could barely form the words. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to lock the door and never open it again, but something, some force, was pulling me toward the unknown. I stepped out onto the porch, my legs heavy with dread. The night was unusually still, not a single breeze stirring the trees or rustling the leaves. The world felt like it was holding its breath. The house behind me loomed dark and silent, but the weight of the air around us seemed to press in. The footprints led into the yard, faint but unmistakable. They seemed to fade slightly as they reached the grass, as though the person, or thing, was disappearing into the night. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "We have to follow them," Daniel said behind me. His voice was tight with apprehension, but there was something else there, something that made it sound like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. I didn't want to go further, but I knew we couldn't just stand there, wondering. We had to know. I moved slowly, each step feeling like it took a lifetime. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft crunch of the grass beneath my feet. I glanced back at the house once more, feeling a pang of regret. But there was no turning back now. The prints continued toward the side of the house, then disappeared into the bushes at the edge of the property. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine as I neared the point where they seemed to vanish. It was as if the footprints had been swallowed whole, leaving no trace behind. "Look," Daniel said suddenly, his voice filled with alarm. He pointed toward the ground near the bushes. At first, I didn't understand. But then I saw it, a shadow, darker than the night around us, moving unnaturally against the moonlight. It wasn't a person, not fully. It seemed to shift, like a mass of darkness, twisting and contorting, as if trying to hold its shape. I took a step back, the air growing colder, heavier. "What the hell is that?" My voice cracked, barely a whisper. "I don't know," Daniel muttered, eyes wide with terror. "But I don't think we should be here." The shadows seemed to notice us, though it wasn't clear how. It wasn't a shape that made sense. It flickered in and out of existence, like an illusion that couldn't be real. But the cold, the sheer wrongness of it, was undeniable. Suddenly, I heard something. A voice. Soft at first, barely audible above the night's silence. But it was there, whispering in the wind, its words unclear. It felt like the voice was calling to me, beckoning me forward. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The cold seemed to seep into my bones, numbing me, making everything feel unreal. I could hear the voice more clearly now, and it was unmistakable. It was my own name, whispered over and over. "Kate. Kate." I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. Only the night, stretching endlessly in every direction. Daniel stood a few steps behind me, looking just as confused and terrified. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. I heard it," he replied, his eyes wide with disbelief. "But there's no one here." The shadow flickered again, drawing my gaze back to it. It was closer now, or at least it seemed to be. The unnatural movement, the shape that couldn't quite be defined, sent a jolt of panic through me. It wasn't a thing, it wasn't a person, it was something else, something beyond our understanding. Without thinking, I turned and ran, pulling Daniel along with me. My heart was racing, pounding in my chest like it was about to explode. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't stay out there. I couldn't let that, whatever it was, get any closer. We rushed back toward the house, the sound of our footsteps the only thing breaking the eerie silence. My lungs burned as I gasped for breath, my mind reeling. The shadows seemed to follow us, though I couldn't tell for sure. I didn't dare look back. When we reached the porch, I slammed the door shut behind us and locked it, my hands trembling. I leaned against the door, panting, trying to calm myself. But it didn't help. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond our sight, was stronger than ever. "Kate," Daniel said, his voice low, filled with fear. "What is happening? This isn't normal." I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what any of this meant. But one thing was clear, whatever had been in those photos, whatever had been following us, was real. And it wasn't done yet. The air in the house felt thick with unease, the weight of something unseen pressing down on us. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside sent my heart into overdrive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that we were no longer alone. It wasn't just fear, it was a deep, primal sense that something not of this world, was closing on us. I tried to convince myself it was just the shock of the night, the stress of everything that had happened. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The photographs, the footprints, the shadow, everything was too wrong. Too real. We sat in silence in the living room, the glow from the table lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Daniel was still staring at the photos, his eyes wide and unblinking. He'd gone through them at least 10 times, but it didn't seem to make any difference. The places in the pictures weren't places we had been. They were somewhere else, somewhere unknown. There has to be an explanation, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't believe it, but I needed to hear it. I needed to believe that this was all just a bizarre misunderstanding, that we hadn't slipped into some nightmare from which there was no escape. But Daniel didn't respond. He just sat there, his hand trembling as he held the camera. He'd been checking it repeatedly, pressing buttons as though something might change. As though he might find some hidden truth in the machine that would explain all of this. I couldn't take it any longer. I needed to get out of the house, to breathe fresh air, to clear my mind. Let's go to the car, I said, grabbing my jacket from the back of the couch. Daniel looked up, his face pale. He nodded slowly, though his eyes were still fixed on the photos in his hands. He was in shock, I could tell. We both were. The question was, what were we supposed to do now? What was out there? We stepped outside, the cold night air stinging my face. The street was quiet, almost eerily so. The lights from the lampposts flickered, casting strange, uneven shadows. I glanced around, half expecting to see something lurking just beyond my line of sight, but there was nothing, just the empty street, the cars parked along the curb, and the distant sounds of the city at night. I can't take this anymore, Daniel said suddenly, his voice cracking. I don't know what's happening, but I can't keep pretending that everything's fine. I know, I replied, feeling the same way. But we have to keep it together. For now, we need to figure this out. We made our way to the car, and I fumbled for the keys in my pocket. As I unlocked the door, I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. A click. I froze, my hand still on the door handle. The air seemed to hold its breath. Daniel was beside me now, his eyes wide with alarm. What was that? I don't know, I said, my voice barely audible. The sound had come from behind us, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. I didn't dare turn around, but every instinct told me to run. But it was too late. The shadow, that same twisted, flickering shape from earlier, appeared in the distance. It wasn't like a person or an animal, it was something else entirely, something unnatural. Its form flickered, distorting the air around it as it moved closer. I could hear its breath now. It was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring our fear. I felt a surge of panic, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground, my body frozen in terror. Get in the car, Daniel urged, his voice hoarse. I didn't need another word. I jumped into the car, locking the door behind me, my hand shaking as I started the engine. Daniel was already in, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror, scanning the street for any sign of movement. We sat there for a moment, not speaking, just listening to the hum of the engine and the soft rustle of the wind outside. But that wasn't enough. I had to see it again, had to know what we were dealing with. I reached for the camera on the passenger seat. Wait, Daniel said, grabbing my wrist. We shouldn't. I need to know, I interrupted, tearing the camera from his grip. I had to see the pictures, had to make sense of them. Maybe they held a clue, something we were missing. I flipped through the images, my breath catching as I saw them again, those same strange places, places we hadn't been. But now, as I stared at the photos, something was different. There, in the background of one picture, was a figure, a dark, indistinct shape standing just outside the frame, barely visible. The same flickering shadow. the same twisted form. I felt my stomach drop. The realization hit me like a punch. The thing wasn't just following us. It had been there all along. "Daniel," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's in the photos. It's been with us from the start." He didn't respond, but his face went white. He looked at the rearview mirror, his eyes widening in horror. It was too late. The shadow was already closing in. And now, we were trapped. The air in the house felt thick with unease, the weight of something unseen pressing down on us. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside sent my heart into overdrive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that we were no longer alone. It wasn't just fear, it was a deep, primal sense that something not of this world, was closing on us. I tried to convince myself it was just the shock of the night, the stress of everything that had happened. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The photographs, the footprints, the shadow, everything was too wrong. Too real. We sat in silence in the living room, the glow from the table lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Daniel was still staring at the photos, his eyes wide, unblinking. He'd gone through them at least 10 times, but it didn't seem to make any difference. The places in the pictures weren't places we had been. They were somewhere else, somewhere unknown. "There has to be an explanation," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't believe it, but I needed to hear it. I needed to believe that this was all just a bizarre misunderstanding, that we hadn't slipped into some nightmare from which there was no escape. But Daniel didn't respond. He just sat there, his hand trembling as he held the camera. He'd been checking it repeatedly, pressing buttons as though something might change. As though he might find some hidden truth in the machine that would explain all of this. I couldn't take it any longer. I needed to get out of the house, to breathe fresh air, to clear my mind. "Let's go to the car," I said, grabbing my jacket from the back of the couch. Daniel looked up, his face pale. He nodded slowly, though his eyes were still fixed on the photos in his hands. He was in shock, I could tell. We both were. The question was, what were we supposed to do now? What was out there? We stepped outside, the cold night air stinging my face. The street was quiet, almost eerily so. The lights from the lampposts flickered, casting strange, uneven shadows. I glanced around, half expecting to see something lurking just beyond my line of sight, but there was nothing, just the empty street, the cars parked along the curb, and the distant sounds of the city at night. "I can't take this anymore," Daniel said suddenly, his voice cracking. "I don't know what's happening, but I can't keep pretending that everything's fine." "I know," I replied, feeling the same way. "But we have to keep it together. For now, we need to figure this out." We made our way to the car, and I fumbled for the keys in my pocket. As I unlocked the door, I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. A click. I froze, my hand still on the door handle. The air seemed to hold its breath. Daniel was beside me now, his eyes wide with alarm. "What was that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice barely audible. The sound had come from behind us, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. I didn't dare turn around, but every instinct told me to run. But it was too late. The shadow, that same twisted, flickering shape from earlier, appeared in the distance. It wasn't like a person or an animal, it was something else entirely, something unnatural. Its form flickered, distorting the air around it as it moved closer. I could hear its breath now. It was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring our fear. I felt a surge of panic, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground, my body frozen in terror. "Get in the car," Daniel urged, his voice hoarse. I didn't need another word. I jumped into the car, locking the door behind me, my hands shaking as I started the engine. Daniel was already in, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror, scanning the street for any sign of movement. We sat there for a moment, not speaking, just listening to the hum of the engine and the soft rustle of the wind outside. But that wasn't enough. I had to see it again, had to know what we were dealing with. I reached for the camera on the passenger seat. "Wait," Daniel said, grabbing my wrist. "We shouldn't." "I need to know," I interrupted, tearing the camera from his grip. I had to see the pictures, had to make sense of them. Maybe they held a clue, something we were missing. I flipped through the images, my breath catching as I saw them again, those same strange places we hadn't been. But now, as I stared at the photos, something was different. There, in the background of one picture, was a figure, a dark, indistinct shape standing just outside the frame, barely visible. The same flickering shadow. The same twisted form. I felt my stomach drop. The realization hit me like a punch. The thing wasn't just following us. It had been there all along. "Daniel," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's in the photos. It's been with us from the start." He didn't respond, but his face went white. He looked at the rearview mirror, his eyes widening in horror. It was too late. The shadow was already closing in. And now, we were trapped. The next morning, the camera was on the ground beside me, the lens cracked. And the photos? The ones I had never taken? They were still there. But now, they showed us, Daniel and me, staring back from the very places we had never been. And I realized then, with a cold shiver running through me, that we had never truly left. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.